All right. Well, I have 2 o'clock and we'll get going. Thank you all for taking the time this afternoon to join us for this little educational session to discuss ultrasound to measure carcass traits in sheep. We've got a number of speakers that are going to talk about a variety of different topics around this subject. I'm really excited to hear from some of them. There's some things that I'm sure I'll pick up that maybe I didn't know before. I've been in and around this concept for quite a while. When I was doing my PhD at Montana State, they were doing some of the early development on what was the appropriate age and time to do loin eye scanning on some of the Western range breeds. And we also have some speakers on here that were in the early stages of development for some of the other breeds in the US. And this technology is used within the NSIP flock breeders across the nation pretty decently, but there still is a lot of opportunity to expand this technology to benefit the sheep industry in the future. Again, my name is Reed Redden. I'm a sheep and goat specialist for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. And we also have a number of people that are joining us from different areas and different parts of the US and different agencies. The next speaker that we're going to have after I do my little welcome and overview is Zach Hagan with Capra Foods, which is located in Goldthwaite, Texas. We're going to have Jake Thorne, an extension associate, going to talk about the genetics of carcass quality. And then Dr. Tommy Perkins from West Texas A&M, Dr. Chris Howard from North Dakota State, and then a producer panel, Mr. Lynn Farmeyer and Mr. Cody Heinke and Miss Kristen Bieber. And I'll give them a bit more of an introduction as we get to that point. Sorry here. So just why is this important and why should we really be thinking about this as a technology to make some improvements? Lamb is a big part of gross sales for any sheep operation. And even if you're in a wool sheep industry or a wool sheep breed, lamb is still generally around 85% of the gross income from an operation, where wool may only be in that neighborhood of 15. Of course, there's going to be some variability there. Our audience today is a largely hair sheep, Dorper influenced, so they wouldn't have any of that wool income. But I think it's interesting to see how people's reactions are to premiums. And so within the wool trade, a lot of people are getting feedback on the quality and the quality characteristics of wool, and they have for years. And so that's been a big emphasis on what genetics they use is based off what they're being told back and premiums that they're getting. Whereas in the lamb sector, generally there's not premiums there. People are just getting paid based off of weight. So their main goals is to just raise bigger sheep. But things are changing in the industry. Just to step back a little bit, talk about carcass facts. If you're not familiar with it, most lambs are going to dress or yield around 50%, meaning that if you hang the carcass, they're going to be their carcass is going to weigh about 50% of what that lamb would be as a live animal. And then if we do even further fabrication to boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts, again, we're going to only have about 50% of that lamb carcass is coming back at as boneless meat, if you will. If you're real familiar with the beef industry, you'll know, or even if you're a beef consumer, of Prime, Choice, and those different grades that are out there. Within the lamb industry, if we have a major packing plant that's doing the grading or quality grading, around 95% of lambs grade Choice. And the other 5% are either Prime or they may not make a grade because of age or something along those lines. So it's not something that really differentiates a lot of lambs, and people get paid big premiums on what their grade is. A lamb yield grade is a mathematical calculation, which is 10 times the back fat plus 0.4, fitting into yield grades of basically 1 to 5. There are some premiums paid based off of what those yield grades are, but most USDA graders are doing that visually without actually taking a measurement. But we are moving into the 21st century, if you will. There are some major packing plants in the US using vision grading, which is a grading system that uses cameras and it detects size, shape, and color, which will, from what data I've seen, is more accurately predicting the cutability of a carcass, and that there are some producers getting paid premiums and potentially discounts for higher, lower cutting carcasses. Some of this could lead to premiums, but ribeye area is not measured. It's not going into these yield grades. Ribeye area could be somewhat involved in the vision grading, but it's not directly measured as it would be in the beef industry. Again, a lot of this is going to be covered throughout this. I just wanted to kind of lead into it, but the BCTRC acronym that I showed before is boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts. Here's a scale of yield grade on your left side and percent cutability of those carcasses based off those different yield grades. And as lambs get fatter, that yield grade is going to go down. Just for your reference, there is a carcass contest equation, and it can be done live or as a straight carcass, which has that boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts and the mathematical calculations from a hot carcass weight, a back fat, body wall, and ribeye area, which can all be measured with ultrasound. And so we'll kind of go through those throughout this talk today. But I always want to kind of think about the big picture of this. And so the bottom right is a USDA National Lamb Carcass Cutout. This is published weekly, which has the different cuts. If you can see my mouse here, their general wholesale price, and then the percentage of the carcass. And I just did some rough calculations. It's interesting because I use the same slide set template from 3 and 10 years ago, and the numbers really aren't all that different. The weight of the rack, so sorry about that. The weight of the rack, or both racks on a lamb, so that's going to be between the 4th and the 5th rib to the last rib, represents 9% of a carcass. Yet, if we look at the value of that total carcass, it would be 22% of the value. And I did it from mathematical calculations off this chart here. And we look at loin. Loin generally represents about the same weight at around 9%, but based off of the fact that lamb chops are higher value, just like a rack of lamb is, that represents 16% of the value of the carcass. So what I'm kind of getting at is if we're using ultrasound to measure ribeye area, the ribeye is the biggest muscle in those two wholesale cuts. And so we can essentially, if we influence that ribeye area, we can influence the biggest or the highest value percentages of the lamb carcass. The leg, while we're not measuring it with ultrasound, there is research that indicates that selecting for a larger loin eye will also increase the size of the leg. Leg is a larger component of a lamb carcass, representing 26% of the carcass based off of this USDA report that I'm showing here. But it's not as high value. It's only 28% of the carcass. But it does come back to the point that loin eye measurements, and if we're influencing that by getting rid of the worst ones and maybe improving the better ones, we can influence close to 70% of the value of a carcass really by looking at almost one muscle. So maybe a little bit oversimplified, but it's a big deal. So what is the way that we do this? It's with ultrasound because it's the best quantitative measure of carcass merit. If we've done any livestock judging, we know that we can evaluate animals and we can estimate, the top, the amount of top that they have, or we're really looking at the rack and the loin. But ultrasound is the only way to quantify that measurement on a live animal. That's realistically, there are some other countries that have used CT scanning, but they're only really looking at a few animals because of the expense related to that. And so still at this point, ultrasound's the most feasible way forward. And that's what this webinar is going to be all about today. So before I end and turn over the mic, I do want to make you aware that we will be following this training up with an ultrasound certification workshop. That workshop will be held on May 4th and 5th at the Hamilton Sheep Station. If you're interested in this, you can send me an email. We'll put you on the list. We'll have a press release and such that comes out at a later date. And actually, this webinar was designed because we were talking about having a workshop, and we saw the need to have general education about the topic firsthand, because there's a lot of people that are really interested in learning the technology, and they may show up at a certification school and find out that they really don't have the time to become a technician that's going to provide this service on a large scale. And so hence we have this webinar to find people that are the right kind to do it, but also educate the seed stock breeders and the commercial industry how this technology works to benefit the sheep industry as a whole. So with that, I will stop, and we will shift gears here a bit. I guess we can take a question or two if there's any that are going to come in. If not, I'll turn the floor over to Zach, and Zach's with Capra. I see he's turned his video on, so ready to go. But before we get started, Brent, do we have any raised hands or anything that we needed to address before I switch gears?
I'm looking through the list. I don't see any.
Okay. All right. Well, I will turn my audio off here. I'll turn the floor over to Zach. I don't know much about you other than we got introduced with this webinar. So I'll let you do an introduction for yourself, but you're with Capra Foods. So why don't you go ahead and share some information to our audience about what the needs are from the meat industry for maybe better carcasses or more consistent carcasses, and I'll let you go from there. So thanks.
Yeah,
Thanks, Reed. No, I appreciate it.
Quit sharing your screen. So there you go. Sorry about that.
All right. No. So thank you there. I'm Zach Hagan. I'm with Capra Foods. I head up their procurement division and kind of producer resource group. So my job is bringing in lambs live. And the significance of ultrasound potential for me is when I'm bidding a lamb live in the field, I'm usually calculating value against what I perceive in the field based on phenotypic qualities. I'm looking at what that lamb's yield is going to be, right? Because I'm focused on carcass size and carcass quality. Now, Capra's a big producer, or I'm sorry, a big packing house for the Dorper, and we tend to favor it because of its carcass quality and its durability in the field. You know, I know there are woolly guys on, and you had a ratio there for wool being 15%, but we are all carcass on the Dorper side. You know, shearing is just a chore at that point, but we don't have to mess with it. I would think some of what's facing the sheep industry today and what we could benefit from by utilizing this sort of technology would be to address the issue of consistency. A lot of that is dictated through genetics, and being able to influence the genetics is the biggest way to make a difference that I see in the sheep industry. And a lot of that starts with the seed stock guys. So one, if we're driving the loin eye size based off of, you know, genetic precursors and being able to see inside of a breeding quality buck and put those out on commercial flocks, ultimately that's just going to enhance the value to the producer because we pay on weight. It's very much the heavier it is, the better it is. But the reason we like the Dorper carcass is because it doesn't pack on fat necessarily like some of the other animals do. So it's a much more muscled carcass. And the final step would be consistency. I don't think anything illustrates that better than after visiting with Alan McAnally and actually Nick Forrest on the subject of this ultrasound school. This was last October. I was down in Goldthwaite, Texas, where our packing house is. And before I left town, I went into the cooler, and there were two carcasses hanging. One was 58.64 pounds, I believe, and the other was like 60.23. So less than a 2-pound spread on the entire carcass. You know, they're peeled and they're on hooks in the freezer, but you look at them, and I immediately had to look at the weight tickets because I was curious. Knowing there was only a 2-pound difference, the shape and size of the cut was completely different. I mean, if you were looking at them in a grocery store, you'd know exactly which leg you were going to buy because we shop and we consume using our eyes. And to have that varied consistency off of animals that are only, different by 2 pounds or less than, is a major hindrance to American lamb production. When the Australians and the New Zealanders are able to put out shipping containers of identical cuts, that's one of the shortfalls that we face with domestic lamb production. While there's a myriad of factors, both on, nutrition, feeding, background, I think the most consistent way to address it would be from a genetic standpoint, where we are working together within the sheep industry. Instead of the packing house working against the producer and the commercial guys pushing on the seed stock, it should flow the other way, right? We should all be working together and managing that data to know we're making the right decisions for our industry and for our personal ranches. I mean, too many times are we all standing around a corral saying, well, that's a real good buck. That's a $1,500 buck. That's a $5,000 buck in the case of some show animals. And we're all looking at the legs. We're looking at how flat his back is. But truth be told, we don't really know his value or his potential until we've opened him up. And by that point, it's too late. So being able to utilize, I think, technology like this, what we're talking about here, is really going to help us in the next coming years to put out quality genetics that are focused on driving profits for the producer. So I think that's what we're all trying to do here today. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to keep going there or who I turn this back over to.
All right.
Or if there are any questions that I can address for anybody.
Well, thanks, Zach. That's very, very helpful. So kind of what I'm hearing is the consistency is probably more important than maybe size. Instead of always trying to get bigger and bigger is bigger, but more consistently bigger.
Correct. It's both. We've run into animals on both ends of the spectrum where I can have a 100-pound animal that will deliver a perfect rack, and I can have a 110-pound animal with a paper thin rack where if you hold it up to the light, it's clearly not a cut or a product that we can put on shelves and ship to the consumer. Or worse, if it makes it to the consumer, we just lost him from the industry. He's not going to come back and spend $22 on a rack that doesn't have any meat on. So I think that's one of the things that could really, we would all benefit from.
Okay, thanks. All right. Do we have any questions for Zach? Hopefully you can hang around for our whole webinar here, and if people have some questions for, they can come back later. But I see Gene Edmondson has a question. Brent, can you unmute him?
Let me get to him here. Okay.
All right, I got it. Thanks, Brent. Zach, is Capra working with the other packers and being able to identify a standard between y'all's part of the industry in providing the feedback to the producers or even the feedlots on what y'all are seeing come across on the rail? Is that something that y'all can drive, or who should be driving what the definitions of the communication back and forth up and down the value stream?
So I think that's a very good question. And unfortunately, what we've seen in the lamb industry is we're not quite to where we're at with cattle here in America. We all have a boss. The seed stock guy answers to commercial, answers to packing house, but we all have a boss, and that's the consumer. So we take the feedback from the consumer as far as, comments as far as inconsistency or flavor preferences, or quite honestly, even marketing. That's why you guys are seeing premiums for, regenerative agriculture or animal welfare standards. It's because it's what the consumer has decided is important to them. But to answer your question specifically, we're not currently have any programs where we're working with other packing houses, but we're in communication with some of them that are receptive to that. I know we've made great strides to try and develop a producer-centric model. A producer-centric model where when you kill with us, you know, not only do you necessarily get a what we call like a harvest report, you know, but a lot of times instead of having 3 or 4 pages there, you have the opportunity to visit with somebody and understand the choices you made in the field and what this piece of paper is telling you and how those interact. You know, if we're seeing a high grade fat cover on the animal, we'd probably recommend toning down your grain, or, you know, it could be 2 things. It could be toning down your grain intake on the animal. And that would definitely be our recommendation. If we saw you pushing a hot feed and you've got blemishes on your liver or kidneys or any other internal organs, that's feedback we would provide you. Or what we'd be able to tell you is you pushed an animal past its optimum weight. Its carcass was a, you know, always destined to be 110 pounds, but you took it up to 130 and you put a bunch of fat on. So my corrective action or my response to that would be, you know, on our next round of culls, we need to focus on getting some bigger ewes that can influence the size and the optimum carcass weight for the lamb she produces. But that's a whole other tangent, but we are trying to actively work with all the producers in our network and provide that feedback. We do site visits, and we're currently here trying to, you know, promote an ultrasound program so we can begin offering those services as well.
Okay, if you don't mind, I do have a follow-up question. I've been doing some direct sales and to different ethnic groups, and the customers that I've been interacting with, there's no consistency within those. You know, different parts of the African continent have different preferences, as well as American and Mediterranean and Asian. You know, it's hard, you know, to try to grow a whole suite of carcass styles to meet all those different customer groups when your genetics are, like in my case, you know, very consistent. So how is Capra addressing that with your producer network?
So I guess the best way to answer that is, like a highway has many exits. That's kind of your sales avenue, right? And so when I take on a producer, I want to let you know that my target is 110, 115 pound lamb. We've determined that to be optimum for the size of cut we're trying to put out and the consistent quality throughout our products headed towards a premium market. That being said, I work with producers. I am one myself. My family raises these. I have never met a producer in my life that is going to bring you a truckload of 100 animals weighing exactly 115 pounds. So we market in multiple tiers across multiple programs. And I try and create outtake opportunities for the producers at all those levels. A good, for example, here would be the rains didn't come. And that storm hit and it froze out everybody's oats, and the lambs are not gaining. So I've got 2 options. Depending on their quality, I'm going to go out in the field and I'm going to look at, you know, my producers' livestock when they call me and they want to work with me. I come out, I look at them and I say, all right, you got 100 head on the ground. It looks like 50 to 60 of these are going to be great quality headed toward a premium market. But tell you what, I can divert the other 40 that we needed, or actually let's call it 39, because there was 39 there. And then that last one you gave antibiotics to. They fall out of our different programs, our premium markets, but there's different outtake options all along the way, even depending on the demographics that you mentioned, as far as we all refer to an ethnic market, but really between South Indian, between Asian, Somalian, and even Latino markets, they actually have different preferences therein too, as far as fat cover, milk lambs. Some of them like a Rayleigh carcass. There's a lot of stuff that's probably, you know, looks Rayleigh and looks wormy, and we're as ranchers thinking, oh, this is a sick lamb, we don't want that. And somebody else is thinking that's a delicacy. It just needs to be, you know, marketed and spiced right, and it'll be perfect. So by providing all of these different outtake options to the producer, we hope to be able to take all your lambs and market them accordingly to whatever they best fit.
Great, thank you.
It's good discussion, but let's try and stay on track here and move on to our next speaker. So next up, we have Jake Thorne. Jake's an extension associate that works with us here at the Research Center. Jake's working on his PhD. A big part of his research is on genetics, both looking at quantitative and molecular predictions for traits within the sheep industry. And Jake is going to talk to us about the genetics of this carcass traits in sheep and where we should be going, maybe where some of the other sheep producers across the country and across the world have gone. So Jake, with that, I'll turn it over and let you get started. Jake, are you on mute?
It would help if I would turn my microphone on, wouldn't it? Okay, thanks, Reed. I appreciate it for the little opening there. As he said, my name is Jake Thorne, and I'm a member of the Sheep and Goat Extension Office here in San Angelo, and then also working on my PhD actually at the University of Idaho, kind of focusing on various elements of sheep genetics. And so I appreciate the opportunity to discuss kind of the genetics of carcass traits this afternoon with y'all. You can tell who trained me. This is my first slide. I think you've already seen this as we started this program. Reed put it together. But along those same kind of points that he made, I just wanted to point out, you know, when we do these measurements of carcass traits, loin muscle size, back fat thickness, we're really measuring the highest value muscle on the carcass. As Reed alluded to earlier, that rack and loin together, even though they're only about a fifth of the carcass as by weight, you know, they're the main driver of the value of that carcass. And so when we're measuring these things, we're really measuring a high value cut, and we're really indirectly measuring the value of that carcass. Okay, so from a genetic standpoint, there are a few concepts that I want to cover first, and just to kind of get our minds in the right direction. And the first of which is this concept of heritability. So heritability can be defined as the amount of phenotypic variation that is attributable to genetic variation. And I know that might be just a little thick to digest right now, but from a less technical standpoint, think of it as how much of a phenotype is driven by the genetics or genotype of an animal. And these heritabilities, they're a quantitatively genetic or a quantitatively derived figure calculated, and they're gonna vary somewhat by breed type, maybe classification within a species, location would be that country or region or whatever. But in general, there have been some you know, there's been so many studies that we can basically decide which traits are more or less heritable. And so heritability is calculated on a 0 to 1 scale, as I've got here. And when we talk about sheep traits, maybe some more highly heritable traits would be those like our wool quality traits. So fiber diameter is actually greater than 0.5 heritability. That's very high in regard to heritability, as opposed to, say, our reproductive traits. So the one I maybe point to first is number of lambs born. That's quite lowly heritable, less than 10%. The traits that we're discussing today, eye muscle depth, back fat thickness, and I didn't even put it on here, growth is kind of very much in this same realm, are what we would consider moderate to actually more highly moderate in terms of their heritability. So we think about from a genetic standpoint, there's certainly selection for these traits should result in progress, but you also need to remember that a large portion of the phenotype of these animals for these traits is still controlled by environmental factors. Okay, so another concept in genetics that's important to understand are that of correlations. And really that can be broken down in, or better defined as the relationship between traits. And these can be positive or negative. So a positive correlation would be, if you selected for increasing trait A, that would also increase trait B. A negative correlation, kind of the opposite. Selection for increased in trait A would decrease trait B. And the opposite is true. So a positive correlation would still be the case if you're selecting to decrease trait A and you see a decrease in trait B. And so again, that's something that maybe takes a little bit to wrap your mind around, but here in a second, hopefully we can clear that up. So let's look at it in regard to maybe some traits that you're familiar with. So weaning weight. Weaning weight is something that most sheep producers, at least somewhat, keep their eye on and potentially select for. And weaning weight is positively correlated with birth weight. So if you select animals for increased weaning weight, you'll probably see a correlated response in increased birth weight. But at the same time, weaning weight is negatively correlated with ewe lamb fertility. And so if you select for increased weaning weight, you're probably going to decrease that corresponding reproductive trait. And so that's just something to keep in mind as we start to think about selection for carcass traits. And so that's what I've got here is actually, how do our carcass traits, eye muscle depth and fat thickness, how do they compare to some of our more productivity driven traits? And so growth, first line here. Maybe this one will actually surprise you just a little bit. Eye muscle depth and fat thickness are actually negatively correlated with growth. And so as we select, or at least let's define growth as post-weaning growth. As we select for faster growing animals, once they've been weaned from their dam, that usually results in a lower eye muscle depth or smaller eye muscle depth, if you may. Now, maybe on a more beneficial factor, if you select for eye muscle depth, you may see a correlated response increase in reproduction. And so reproduction, eye muscle depth, and fat thickness are all positively correlated. Now, what makes this tricky is, and again, this is something that really is dependent upon your target market or what you're trying to do, is, which direction are you selecting these carcass traits for, specifically fat thickness? Are we trying to select for a leaner carcass that requires less trim? Sure, that might increase value, but then you need to think about these correlated productivity traits and how that may impact your flock as the producer. If we select for leaner animals, because fat thickness and reproduction are positively correlated, that would maybe mean that we might see a similar or correlated decrease in reproductive capability. So just something to think about here. Fecal egg count is also negatively correlated with fat thickness and eye muscle depth, but fecal egg count is something that we want to be low. So as we select for more muscular animals, oftentimes we'll see a correlated decrease in fecal egg count. This one's not going to be shocking. Trimmed high-value cuts, positively correlated to eye muscle depth. Again, the larger the loin eye, the larger or the more valuable the trimmed cuts would be. And then same as fat thickness, negative correlation. The less fat there is, the more valuable those cuts. But I guess the point I want to make here, and we sort of alluded to it and Reed touched on it in his opening, is that when we select for, or when we measure eye muscle depth and select for that, we're also selecting for a more muscular animal all throughout, because eye muscle and leg and muscles throughout the body are correlated to one another. Maybe not perfect correlation, but they certainly are strongly correlated to one another. And so this one tool that we're going to discuss today, eye muscle measurement, is essentially a representation of muscularity of that entire animal. And now, how are fat thickness and eye muscle depth correlated to each other? And that's a bit of a trickier one to answer. Honestly, dependent on breed type and location and whether in the United States or Australia, the reports are a little bit contrasting. Some say that there's a negative correlation, some say a slight positive correlation. For all intents and purposes, we're going to say that there's not a significant impact on each other between those two traits. Okay, so what are some examples of some previous genetic selection, and how has maybe carcass traits been affected by that, or how they fit into those scenarios? And so maybe one of the earliest tools that the industry has used for genetic selection was centralized performance testing. This has been going on for several decades, maybe most prominently in our fine wool breeds. And if you're not familiar with it, essentially, animals from several flocks are brought to one location. They're measured for a whole host of traits, and that might include everything from growth to wool quality to ribeye area or loin muscle area and fat depth. And then often case, at least in the case of Rambouillet, is there's an index that's calculated, and that essentially provides somewhat of a ranking of how those animals did on the test. And it also provides a tool back to the producer that allows them to select for multiple traits. Now, the ROM index that is calculated or was calculated here at the A&M station and then the other universities that host RAM tests, it includes the traits of average daily gain, fleece weight, and fiber diameter. Carcass traits are not included in that index. And it's important to remember that this index has been a very influential driver of selection in this breed for a long time. And we just talked about correlations a second ago. And growth, average daily gain, is a key component of this index. Well, growth, again, like I said, is negatively correlated with carcass traits, or the ones that we're focusing on. Fleece weight, however, is positively correlated with loin muscle depth. It is negative with fat depth. And then fiber diameter, another key component of that index, is slightly positive for both traits. And so I guess the point I'm getting at is that, if ROM index or this index was a key driver of Rambouillet selection for a long time, you could almost say that because the growth and the fleece trait correlation sort of canceled each other out, it's really not surprising that over the last 25 years of that test, there really wasn't a big change in ribeye area or fat depth in Rambouillet. I'm not saying that those carcass traits were big drivers of selection, or maybe they were for certain flocks, but it's just interesting to see that they remained pretty static as that index was utilized by that breed for a long time. Okay, so really, what is the most effective way of using carcass measurements? And I think maybe to your point, Gene, and some of the other things that have been talked about, how do you take these measurements and use them within your own production scheme most effectively? And really, from our perception, the most effective way to do this is through the utilization of estimated breeding values that are calculated by the National Sheep Improvement Program. The National Sheep Improvement Program is not new. It's been around for quite a while, but it's really only recently kind of taken off as far as popularity. And the key here is that NSIP is testing animals against one another in their own environment. And it's, again, there's a whole host of traits, including carcass traits, that NSIP measures. But the key here is that we're trying to eliminate that environmental factor that may really influence these different phenotypes. So if you'll remember back to your genetics class back whenever that was, a key formula that you might recall, phenotype really equals genotype and environment. And what NSIP is trying to do is calculate a value that represents just this portion of the equation, the genetics or the genotype, and eliminate the environmental factor from the comparison. And so we do that by forming contemporary groups. And so I take a whole cohort of animals and treat them as similar as possible. Maybe not exact, but at least try to feed them or put them in a similar pasture scenario, keep them in the same location, take these measurements for whatever trait it is at the same time of year as for all the animals, adjust for things like if this lamb was a single or a twin or a triplet, how old its dam was. All those things can affect phenotype. And so we try to control for those as best as possible to calculate an EBV, or an estimated breeding value, that represents just that genotypic or genetic portion of that equation. And so what you end up with is an animal that's got this whole profile of EBVs for a variety of traits. And we can go, we could probably spend a whole afternoon just talking about this alone. But I mean, I want to draw your attention, because this is the topic of the day, to these two right here, post-weaning fat and post-weaning eye muscle depth. And you'll notice that you've got these scores here. For post-weaning fat, a negative 0.5, and for eye muscle depth, a positive 1.7. And really what that represents is that this animal has the genetic value to be 0.5 millimeters leaner than average, which we're going to call 0 for all these traits, and 1.7 millimeters greater in eye muscle depth compared to average. And so for the most part, those would be considered valuable tools or beneficial selection directions, if you may. At this point, I've used the phrase loin muscle depth. And if you're familiar from the cattle industry or whatnot, you may have heard it as ribeye area or loin muscle area. And so why do we use loin muscle depth in the sheep world? Well, there's probably some other people on this webinar today who can maybe speak to this even a little better than I can. But in all reality, loin muscle depth and area are highly correlated to one another. These are the correlations that are represented here or reported here in the US. If you include some Australian data, this gets even higher. And so really the takeaway here is loin muscle depth is very predictive of loin muscle area. Here's the equation to convert that. If you had loin muscle area and you wanted to maybe convert that to loin muscle depth for whatever reason, this would be the equation that you would use. But really the reason why we use loin muscle depth is because it's a more straightforward measurement. Based off the shape of the eye, clarity of technology, whatever else, measuring the area can be a little bit tricky for sheep. And there's actually been some research reported where scans were done over multiple years by multiple people, and the repeatability of loin muscle area was decently high, but it wasn't perfect. And so we go to this loin muscle depth because it's just a little bit easier to measure. Okay, so back to the discussion on NSIP. What are the results of using this technology and maybe some other breeds? And so probably the most influential breed based off of Carcass traits would be the Suffolk, or it's one of our terminal sire breeds. And so how have they trended for these traits over time? Well, the graph there on the left shows post-weaning fat and eye muscle depth for the last decade or so. And you can see that eye muscle depth is on average for that breed increasing, and post-weaning fat is decreasing. So we're more muscular animals that are leaner, and from a terminal sire standpoint, that would be beneficial. But at the same time, on the graph on the right, you'll see that weaning weight and post-weaning weight are also increasing. And I just finished telling you that growth and eye muscle depth are antagonistic traits. And so how are we able to increase both of those traits at the same time if they're negatively correlated with one another? And really the answer to that is the employment of indexes. And so again, from a breeding standpoint, there's a whole host of indexes that exist. But the Carcass Plus index is really the one that's influenced this trend between these two. And so you'll notice that this index takes into different weightings of various traits, and those traits may be antagonistic to one another, and it compiles it into one single figure that producers can use as a selection tool. And using that Carcass Plus index has really driven this breed to be faster growing and still have increasing eye muscle depth and leanness at the same time. Now it's important also when calculating these, they're adjusted for a certain size. When we think about measuring animals, particularly that are quite young or smaller, body size is really going to influence that measurement of ribeye. I don't want you to confuse body size necessarily with weight, but young animals, how big they are is going to influence that weight. And so we make adjustments for this to a standard weight so that we can pair animals within the breed, even if they were measured at slightly different times or sizes throughout their life. For our wool breeds, this adjustment is much higher. They're later maturing animals. I think it's closer to 180 pounds is the standard figure there. Okay, so what's really the impact of these values on money back in your pocket? And so this paper was published in 2014, and this is a pretty influential set of sheep geneticists and production or industry members here. And they set out to answer the question, how does weight, fat depth, carcass measurements, how does that impact carcass yield and value? And I realize this is an intimidating table here on the right, and we're not going to go through this too precisely here. But I guess I want to draw your attention to a few figures here. And so what they were able to do is they took about 500 wether lambs, they weighed them and ultrasounded them for carcass traits several times before harvest, and then they, after harvest, collected a whole host of carcass information. And when you look at the value of the trimmed carcass, which is what's signified here, and these corresponding regression coefficients, which really mean, you don't need to necessarily memorize this, but I guess just look at their size compared to one another and whether they're positive, negative. The takeaway here was that weight of that animal was highly significant on the carcass value. Not a shocker. But ultrasound loin muscle depth was also fairly significant as far as impact on carcass value. And fat depth, when you control for somewhat of size, was actually only very slightly negative, had a very slightly negative impact on carcass value. Now this is in a terminal sire breed. So these were Suffolk rams, which are already fairly lean animals. And so maybe this from, cross breeds, there's to be some adjustments here. But the takeaway was that these two carcass traits had differing impact on the value of the endpoint carcass. And they actually were able to translate this to a monetary figure. And so for every increase in 1.8 millimeters of fat depth, that increased carcass value by $2.45. And for every increase in 1.18 millimeters of fat depth, that decreased the carcass value 36 cents. To make those figures a little easier to digest, I converted them to 1 square centimeter and 1 centimeter, and you can see the corresponding values there. The reality is, from a genetic standpoint, you're not going to increase muscle depth or fat depth by 1 square centimeter or 1 centimeter just from genetics alone. Maybe nutrition and whatever could influence that, but just genetically, the increases are much more similar to what's reported here. But again, these authors took this one step further, and this is really interesting. So what they did is they said, what would be the difference in the value of the trimmed carcasses if we had used rams that were superior for all 3 of these traits versus those that were just average for those traits? And so they took NSIP breeding values, and they took the comparison or the percentile rankings for the Suffolk breed at the time in 2014, and they looked at only if they had used rams that were in the top 10% or the best 10% for weaning weight, fat depth, and loin muscle depth. And those are the corresponding values or EBVs for each of those traits at the time. And then they compared them again to rams that were just average for the breed. And what resulted from this is they realized that if they had used superior rams for all 3 of those traits, for every 100 lambs that one of those rams produced, the corresponding increase would be $587 based off of added growth, $15 based off of a little bit leaner back fat, and another $97 based off of increased loin depth. So obviously growth is the driver here, but particularly for loin depth, that's not an insignificant amount that can be added by using a quote unquote superior ram. And so, that kind of should get your mind working about how much is a ram worth to me as a producer, and what are the traits that that ram possesses that can put money directly back into my pocket. So those percentiles came from 2014. This is the more recent Suffolk percentile, and you can see that post-weaning weight and post-weaning fat have really trended even more extreme. And so those dollar amounts actually might be a little outdated, if you may. And so there could be some changes, even more influential based off of those two traits and more increased value in terms of trimmed carcass. So where are we going, as far as genetics and carcass value? Well, if we look at Australia, certainly the direction that they've gone is towards eating quality. I'm starting to incorporate that into some of their genetic evaluations. And so I've got two indexes here that Australia has started to employ. And first is total carcass production, I think is what TCP stands for, and then lamb eating quality here. And the guidance behind creating this total carcass production, or TCP index, was, well, let's at least try to maintain eating quality while improving other traits, because there has been shown a negative correlation as we make leaner animals, less back fat, a decrease in eating quality. And so in this instance, they've weighted these two eating quality traits, intermuscular fat and shear force, which would be a measurement of tenderness, and into this index that also includes eye muscle, post-weaning weight, and fat depth, and they've weighted it differently. And again, a producer could use this index if they want to at least just maintain eating quality in their flock while selecting for other traits. Now, if they wanted to improve eating quality, they could use this LEQ index. And you can see that the weightings for IMF and shear force are much greater in this one. Now, what's really been the caveat, or what's allowed them to construct these indexes, is the formation of nucleus flocks in Australia. So large flocks that are tested for a whole host of traits, and they're also, from a genomic standpoint, or DNA tested. And the reasoning there is, IMF and shear force, those are great things to measure, but as somebody alluded to earlier, we measure those on animals that are dead, already been harvested, and they're not a great breeding prospect after they've been harvested. And so what genomics allows us to do is to make better, more predictive, or I guess more accurate predictions of traits and estimated breeding values of an animal earlier in its life. And its own phenotype isn't as important in the construction of an EBV. And so using genomics, we can make better predictions of animals for traits like IMF and shear force without having to harvest them. So try to wrap things up. I've only got a 30-minute time slot here, but just to go back to what somebody has said earlier, is, there's a few different avenues as far as selling your lambs. And I mean, if you're just going through the traditional route, selling at the sale barn, well, obviously weight is going to be the driving force there. Or even if you go to a packer that only is paying off weight, well, then, growth is going to be what puts money back into your pocket. But that's not the only avenue for selling. Maybe you sell to a packer that does offer a grid. This is a very basic grid down here, but there might be some things included in that for primal cut value, trim primal value, size, whatever. And so not only would weight be important to you and yield grade, which is what this grid represents in its relationship with fat thickness, but also trimmed carcass weight. Or for those of you like Gene who are trying to do some direct sales, well, maybe actual weight isn't as important, but eating quality and again, the trim cut yield, those things become very important. And so really how you employ this technology is going to be dependent on what your goals are. What are you trying to do as far as selling your animals? And so wrap some things up, I'll wrap up here with a few takeaways. First and foremost, carcass ultrasound is a direct measurement of what is essentially the highest value portion of the carcass. And carcass traits are pretty highly moderately heritable, but they can still be significantly affected by environment. So it's really important that if we're going to make selections to improve carcass traits, we have to still control for that environmental factor. And so really the most effective way to do this is by using estimating breeding values and trying to stay away from single trait selection. Because if we're just selecting for carcass traits, because of those negative correlations that I talked about with some other production traits, you could potentially get into an issue in the performance of your animals. Vice versa, if you don't select at all for carcass traits, how might that change based off of your selection for other traits? So you don't want to get too far on an extreme either way there. Another takeaway, good rams are worth it, in my opinion, but is that the same thing as an expensive ram? That's philosophical. I don't have an answer for you there, but it's just something to think about. And then also, again, let your marketing channel dictate your selection criteria, how you use carcass value, carcass measurements, and how important they are to you. So hopefully, we touched on a little bit of the genetics here, just in a short time period, but I'd be happy to answer any questions if you guys have them.
Thanks, Jake. Appreciate that. I think I don't see any raised hands at this moment. So for the sake of time, so that we don't take away from some of our other speakers, we might move right along. And then if we have some extra time at the end, we can do some questions. But no, that was good stuff. It's a lot of complicated factors when you get into the genetics, the devil's in the details sometimes on some of these goals that we're trying to accomplish. So now we're going to transition to our next speaker. Dr. Tommy Perkins is going to talk to us. So hopefully he's still with us, sharing his screen. Little introduction here. Dr. Perkins is a graduate of West Texas A&M University, where he was recognized as a graduate of distinction by the Department of Ag. In 2014, he earned a doctorate degree in animal breeding from Texas Tech in 1992. He served as a professor at Missouri State and Texas State for nearly 20 years, where his professional career is most noted for excellence in the field of beef cattle ultrasound. Perkins has previously served on the Beef Improvement Federation Board of Directors and also currently serves as the chairman of the End Product Committee. Additionally, Perkins has served on the board of directors for the Texas Beef Council, Beef Promotion and Research Council of Texas, the National Pedigreed Livestock Council, and United States Livestock Genetics Export Council. He completed a 2-year term as president of the Beef Breeds Council after serving as their director for 10 years. Perkins also served as the executive vice president of the International Brangus Breeders Association, chief executive officer of Genetic Performance Solutions, and president of Brangus Publications Incorporated. He currently serves as associate professor and is holder of the Dean Hawkins Endowed Chair for Cow-Calf Management at West Texas A&M University in Canyon, Texas. So if you picked up on any of that introduction, you can recognize the skill set that Dr. Perkins has in this area, and I'm very much looking forward to it. Before I turn it over, if you're in the academic world, it's not that far in the lineage where we've shared different advisors, or different advisors have produced someone that was advisor or we worked with at different times, which in most of our background, Dr. Perkins, we don't have anything, but Dean Hawkins, who is the endowed chair name that you worked for, was actually on my master's committee when I was at New Mexico State. So there is one link there. So, there you go. Again, thanks for coming and speaking with us today. I'm really looking forward to you sharing your experience with the beef cattle industry And one of the advantages of being 20 years behind everyone else is you get to learn all the mistakes everyone else made and hopefully not create them. So we look forward to hearing what you have to say today.
Thanks, Dr. Redden. I appreciate the opportunity to be on the program and appreciate all the speakers that are here. And Jake, good job on those indexes. Man, I tell you, I wish the beef industry had jumped on those as quick as you guys did, because we kind of fell behind there. But look forward to that. And I really feel like I'm the old guy on the program. They asked me to talk a little bit about the history of what is going on. And I've been in this business since the early, well, I guess I should say late 80s when I started this process. And I actually go back to the old Loca 210 days where you had to use split screen imaging and tried to match up both ends of the ribeye. And that was not very successful, to be honest with you. But luckily they did make some changes. And if you see the picture I just put up there, in the late 80s, Dr. Jim Stoker, who actually trained me to ultrasound back at that time, he did and I'm not as old as him for sure, to have had done this since the 1950s, but he did all the work in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, getting us to this point. And that Carcass probe you see there really changed what's going on in the beef industry. And we still use that thing today. And I'll share a little bit about that particular unit later on and how it is going to be changing in the very near future. But that probe really changed things for us. Now that doesn't impact sheep breeders or goat breeders, because when you're looking at a loin eye depth, that length is not important to you guys. So we'll talk about that a little bit here in just a bit as well. So what was going on in the late 80s and very early 90s, Texas Tech University and Iowa State University were pretty heavily involved in picking up the technology from Dr. Stouffer and kind of moving it forward. And what we found that Texas A&M stepped up to the plate in 1989, and they actually held the first ultrasound certification for beef technicians. And that was pretty significant. And I know a lot of folks that went through that process. A few of those are still actually scanning today. But that was a very good process that we went through that allowed people to be trained and to make sure that they were getting valid data. Now, what happened in the mid-1990s, we saw Mike Deitman at Kansas State University. He really took this, and he was using the Brinks Brangus cattle to do some research. And he was the first one to really implement the intramuscular fat measurement. And I'll talk at length about that here near the end, the significance of intramuscular fat involved in the cattle industry. Now, it was interesting that Dr. Redden said that sheep typically grade choice and prime. I was not aware of that necessarily, and because I haven't scanned that many sheep and goats, but I would. That's intriguing to me as I look forward to some research projects to grad students that we look into that some in the future for sure. In 1998, we had our first formal organization of beef cattle ultrasound technicians. We called ourselves animal ultrasound practitioners, and they were basically being watched by the Beef Improvement Federation and kind of giving us guidelines on what we needed to do. But it was one of those, it was really driven by technicians. It was not driven by a breed association or any other entity. It was really just the technicians doing all of that work. Maybe I can get it to go forward here. In 2001, after these particular technicians kind of did it on their own, and they did a great job of setting and I was part of that group, obviously, but it really set the stage for what the United States Beef Breeds Council wanted to do moving forward. And they renamed it to the Animal Proficiency Testing and Certification Process. And what happened there is we really got under the guidance of what breed associations wanted. And the first speaker talked about the consumer really guiding us on what we need to do in an end product. Same thing was happening with ultrasound back in the early 2000s. The Beef Breeds Council wanted to have a little more control over the data that was going into their database for those genetic evaluations. Now, I'm here to tell you 25 years later, I don't know that I would recommend that for another group moving forward at quite the extent we've seen in the beef industry. And again, I'll talk about that here at the end when we get on some of the issues that I see could be improved on the beef side of it. In 2001, Iowa State University did open the first centralized ultrasound processing lab. And that basically meant that a technician would be certified and collect an image and send it to a lab that would not be at shoot side, would not see what the animals look like, give a data back to the breed association to go into the genetic evaluations. And that soon opened up into what we call Walter and Associates as we know them today. And I guess because of Iowa State and their guidance with the American Angus Association, we found that another name change was needed, and it went into what we call the USGC, the UGC, the Ultrasound Guidelines Council, and that's what we use today. Pretty much the same guidelines, whether it was APTC or UGC, we pretty much stayed on the same guidelines. And I thought I'd share those with you just a little bit. There have been a few changes made in the Ultrasound Guidelines Council. Even though we've been going about 20 some odd years now, there's been a few recent changes that I'll talk about in terms of getting our technicians certified. We do have a UGC board of directors made up of breed associations, members that are elected by the U.S. Beef Breeds Council. And again, that's important because the data is going into their genetic evaluation. So they need to have some input into that information that's going there. We also have the 3 labs that are involved in interpreting the images. Each one of them have a representative on that board of directors. There's a 4th lab that could have a data, but they don't necessarily want to sit on that lab, so they don't sit there. We always have 1 certified technician. That's generally a technician been certified many years that sits on there and gives the technician's perspective when they formulate any type of the guidelines. We also have what I'll call the research committee. We also call them the systems review committee. It's always made up of industry or university researchers, and they're really responsible for looking at new hardware, new software, and the marriage between those two to make sure that they're getting approved through scientific research and that they are giving us valid data points. Then we do have an executive director that sits on that particular committee, even though he doesn't vote. And some of you are going to know some of our previous executives. I know that Dr. Mike Tess would be one that some of you recognize. Dr. Mike McNeil was the most recent one. And now we have Patrick Wall, who's an Iowa State graduate that is now running the association. And that's kind of a part-time deal, but it is important that they sit on there. This is the process we go through, and I did look at kind of what your guidelines were that you're going through and your certification process. We're very similar to that. We've done this process for over 20 years now. They do have a written exam, and I don't know how many times you can teach them how to yield grade and quality grade cattle, but those test questions are always on there, and we don't normally have people fail because of the exam. They do a pretty good job there. We still are collecting well, we're required to collect 2 ribeye images and at least 4 IMF images. At certification, we also have a rump image, and I didn't see anything in the sheep side where you guys are actually looking at the biceps femoris or the gluteus medius muscle like we do in cattle. But there's some areas for probably some research in the sheep industry where we might look at some rump things going on, especially in quality, that I'd be interested in looking and visiting with you guys about in the future on that. New to our process, and I noticed that you guys scan 20 head, repeat scan those, and that's how your statistics are calculated. We actually have gone to scanning 40 head of cattle, or some cases a few more than that, and we don't repeat scan. That basically came about because of Dr. Mike Tess looked back at about 12 years of certification processes and found that folks just did not fail certification on their repeatabilities. So repeatability was not a good one. It's better if we could get more animals involved in it. And we've moved to that, and it's worked out very, very well for us to get that done. If you are on here and you're an ultrasound technician that went through certification at Kansas State last year, found that there was a lot of problems in the process because they didn't address the ones on the screen now, getting a variety of marbling, ribeye sizes, fat thicknesses. The cattle were extremely hard to scan and created some issues for the technicians. And I'll show you an image in a minute why that can be a problem with our technology. They just changed this one as well, that at least 75% of the cattle have to be harvested because, again, we're not repeat scanning. So we want more of those cattle harvested to collect more data points. West Texas A&M University is actually going to be hosting the Fall 21 certification. So those of you that may be interested in getting certified on the beef cattle side of it, we'll be hosting that here in Canyon, September the 16th through the 18th. So as you talk through and you've got this equipment and you're out scanning sheep and goats anyway, it might be a really good opportunity for you to get out and scan some cattle and help pay for the equipment. There's certainly a lot more cattle to be scanned than we have technicians in areas. So be a good opportunity for some of you if you're interested. We do put a 3-minute time limit on those folks per head. I don't like that. In certifications that we do, we try not to put that kind of pressure on some of these technicians, and we work with them, but you can't be there all day as well. So I know it is important. We also have a continuing education portion of our certification process that you have to participate in, and it depends on where the certification takes place and what that might look like. Here at WT, we're probably going to be doing some carcass evaluation in the packing plant when we host it. We also, again, through the 3 different organizations we've always had an absentia program, and this allows technicians that have scanned multiple years, scanned thousands and thousands of head of cattle, not to continue to have to go back and do a certification process. And that worked very, very well. We've made a few revisions in 2010, but in 2020, there were some major revisions that actually went on. And if you're an ultrasound technician on this call, you probably heard some of the complaining that was going on. Technicians that have scanned for 20 years and probably had 300,000 head of cattle under their belt had to go back and recertify. No one failed those certifications for sure. We didn't lose any of those, but we did find some things in that, and I'll talk about here in just a minute what we found because of that process. But we have just this year updated again so technicians can go through an absentia and not necessarily have to go back and get recertified every 2 years like is currently being made. So what we're basically saying is you have to scan 3,000 head of cattle in the past, and most recently you had to scan 250 head in 2019 and 250 head in 2020. Very easy to do for a beef cattle technician. That's usually 1 or 2 days out scanning cattle, and you've hit 250 in 1 day. So not hard to do. And then you pay a $200 fee instead of the $600 to $900 you might pay at a certification process to get this accomplished. So very doable, and I appreciate that they reinstated absentia, but also appreciate the fact that we did learn some things from the other process. Now, some of you might not be aware of all of the different hardwares that might be out there, ultrasound systems. And this is a list that I tried to get as many on there as I could. I've scanned with all of those except for the IBEX, I guess. The old Aloka, which is kind of the gold standard, was replaced by the new Aloka. And those 2 units, if you've got one, they've got value. If they've got any quality to them at all, those are no longer being made. So there'll never be any new Aloka 500s out there. So they're being sold at a premium right now, even the used equipment that are in really good shape. But that's kind of the gold standard in the beef industry. That's what we've always used, and we've now migrated in a few of these newer ones like the Aquila, the old Classic that we had, and the newest one that's on the block now is the EI Medical Evo. We just purchased an Evo. We just completed a research project comparing the new Aloka to the new Evo head-to-head in a competition. I've got a PhD student that will be presenting that day to the summer, and it looks like the new Evo is going to be very comparable, if not even better in some aspects than the old Aloka. Price-wise, it's not any better in terms of price, but it does look like it's going to be one that's going to be able to replace it. In terms of price, and I guess when we talk about this is always the problem, when we bring these technologies to the industry, they have an expensive bill to them. And I've been doing this for nearly 30 years, and the price continues to go up instead of go down. And people always have questions on why could that be possible, but it's very simple. We don't use enough of the units out in the industry. You know, when you're only selling 20 in a year, manufacturers are not going to line up and try to make that little widget because they just don't sell enough of them. So we're just going to have to know that we're going to have to bear this cost if we're going to scan cattle and make the changes that we need to. The new Evo is not priced any better than the old Alokas. So if you're an Exago user, the one on the very bottom there, it is a bit less expensive. But I've scanned with it and found that there's a few more issues with it in terms of what the transducer looks like and how it handles when you're scanning. And certainly if I were trying to scan some smaller sheep and goats, how it could be a little problematic using that one. Another issue that we have with the current systems that we're using, and this really goes back to the software we're using, not the hardware, but you have to have a frame grabber in many of these or a USB. These are the ones that are actually certified to be used in the industry. Unfortunately, some of these frame grabbers are no longer being made. And once they go out, there's no longer ability to use that software with a loco or any other machine. So that's one of the newer problems facing the beef industry right now is we've lost utilization of some of these frame grabbers, which we have to have. Now, some of the newer technologies are using USBs. The Evo is a really neat machine because it's all built in, and we don't have to worry about these external frame grabbers that we've got. So those of you that are looking for new technology, you haven't bought anything yet, certainly the Evo looks like it's going to be a really good alternative to those. This one kind of talks about the different softwares that are available, and that list is pretty long there, but it really goes back to what each lab is doing. If you take the first two up there, the BIA and the BIA Pro Plus, those are used that's from the Arkansas lab, which is the ILIA lab, which I'll talk about in a minute. But that software, one is to build certification to send image to a certified lab. The BIA Pro, which I'm going to show you what the benefits of that particular software here in a minute, but that BIA Pro allows you to interpret at shoot site, which I see a lot of value that sheep and goat breeders could actually use the BIA Pro Plus software. The next one is CPEC, and that was developed by John Breathauer at Kansas State. It now is currently being, I believe, Craig and Becky Hayes with their Ultra Insights lab in Colorado actually are the caretakers of the CPEC software for seed stock industry. The next three, Black Box Pro, Cut Box, those all go to the National Cut Lab in Ames, Iowa. That's the systems that they use. And I'm not sure what the scanning partner UIC S or UIC2 are, but I'm guessing they go back to the National Cup Lab is who's utilizing those. Again, those are certified capturing systems that allow you to capture an image and get those images sent to a certified lab, which again, I'm going to talk about some of the reasons why I don't like that particular process. These are the three labs that we as beef technicians have the opportunity to send data to or images to. The Cup Lab in Ames, Iowa, ILIA, which is in Harrison, Arkansas, and then we've got Ultra Insights, which just moved to Pierce, Colorado out of North Missouri. But that's only three options we really have to send images from beef cattle that get put into national cattle evaluation programs. And in it really is not a lot of difference in any of the labs you go to. I'll talk about that here in just a minute, but this is probably one of my pet peeves, and this is probably one thing that has hurt our industry. And I can certainly see it being a little bit of detriment to the sheep and goat industry because the three labs seem to want to charge an excessive amount of money per animal scanned to utilize their software and those algorithms, which this price has continued to go up, as I stated, like the hardware. And I'm not sure that this is conducive to keep our industry going like it needs to. These costs should be going down based on numbers that you scan and interpret, but they just typically seem to be going up. And it's hard to justify paying $3 per animal, especially in sheep and goats when you're scanning these guys. If we could get that reduced, I think we could see a lot more beef cattle scanned for sure, and certainly some more sheep and goats that would be scanned. But that's kind of where we're at in the industry, and that's what they're charging us for it. When you go through these processing labs, they're going to give you back data to the association. And I've just kind of highlighted that for you so you can kind of see. Oops, maybe not. So rump fat ultrasound, 12th rib fat thickness, 12th rib area, and percent intramuscular fat. Those get adjusted within each breed association, not by the lab that actually interpreted the image. Those go back to the lab and get those adjustments based on breed association rules. On the sheep and goat side of it, it looks like they give you back loin eye area measurement with ultrasound, loin eye depth measurement, and it also looks like they give you a back fat measurement. And interesting in the swine side of that, that the lab seem to be giving back 12th, 13th rib measures, but a lot of those data points should be taken at the 10th rib in the swine industry. So again, our labs haven't necessarily stayed up with some of the technologies where they need to be changing. Just again, in my opinion. So let's go back to absentia. And I said that there was a big uproar with all the technicians that had to come back and they'd scanned hundreds of thousands of cattle, they had to come back and scan cattle again and get recertified. We learned a lot of things from that, and I'll just kind of put all these up here so you can kind of see as I address those. Technician effect is the one that we see the most. And if you're an individual here that wants to be a technician, we find that there are differences among technicians, but usually we find that their bias is pretty consistent across animals or across images. Typically in the cattle side of it, we see individuals that like to scan next or close to a rib, whether that's the 12th rib or the 13th rib, it seems to be a little clearer image. Those technicians always have a smaller ribeye area than someone that is scanning correctly, which is directly between the 12th and 13th rib, because we know that area is just slightly bigger. So we do know that we have some technician effect in that, but again, if you do it consistently, the genetic model accounts for that. So I'm not too worried about that one at all. Lab effects, if we take the same image and send it from one lab to another lab to a third lab, do they come out the same? I currently have a research project going on with a graduate student where we're actually looking at this. Preliminary data looks like there are differences among labs interpreting the same image, which you wouldn't think that, but as we've investigated into it just a bit further, it looks like the standoff pads that they use to get ribeye measurements and the fat thickness measurements have an impact on ultimate 12th rib fat thickness. So there's slight differences in terms of the actual value, but the correlations that we see in terms of related to the kill data or harvest data does not seem to have an impact there. But not all labs interpret exactly the same. Management effects plays a lot of this, not necessarily in the sheep and goat side of it, certainly in the beef side of it. It impacts marbling is what it impacts. If we have a breeder that gets their cattle up the night before and sets them in a dry lot before we scan the next morning, we typically see that it's impacted marbling. Typically lowers the marbling, scoring those cattle, which we don't like to see, as you can well tell. Some people hold them off of feed and water, which we never recommend. So if you're, again, new to this and you're going to be scanning some sheep and goats, we never recommend taking off of feed and water. Certainly never take them off of water. That even imparts some bias on the ribeye size or loin eye size. So be careful there. Weather affects more on the quality grade of the animal and not so much on the ribeye or the fat thickness. So, but weather can play a big part of that. And then the last one we did find, the system effect. This one came about because of where we brought everybody back in. And we found that technicians may have had perfect image quality. The system that they had was certified. The software they used were certified. The image quality passed with glowing standards, but they were not interpreting some of the values correctly. And typically it was the intramuscular fat values. So there's something going on internally in some of these older machines that we didn't find and the labs didn't pick up on that created a problem. And we're addressing those now as we get set. So begin in the sheep industry, if you're not looking at quality grade, maybe that's not so important. But again, if the Australians are starting to look at quality in sheep, I suspect that this could be an issue at some point, even in the sheep industry. Now, the big question is we've done all this for some nearly 30 years. Have we made an impact on the industry? And I'm here to tell you that I think that we've done a really good job in terms of the industry. If you look back to the first week in February 2021, 12% of beef carcasses graded prime. And traditionally, if you go back 5 years ago, that'd be closer to 2.5%, 3% that would have graded prime. So does that mean that ultrasound had something to do with that? My guess is that yes, it has, because again, we can take like the Angus Association, for example, they might put 300,000 animals in their database with ultrasound data. And again, marbling happens to be one of those that breeders typically want to make sure that they're improving, and they've done a great job of doing that. As a matter of fact, if you look at that image, and if I were to poll you on that image, can anyone tell me if there's some errors that might be going on there? Can you see why a technician might have trouble certifying, trying to interpret that particular image, especially in the medial end? And when you get down to the lower left bottom portion of that image, you lose everything. You can't see the intercostal muscles. You just can't see the medial end of the longissimus dorsi muscle. So it presents some problems. So we've done such a good job with marbling in these cattle that we have really stretched our technology just a little bit in finding that ribeye at the bottom of that and then doing a better job with it. So the other carrot to this one is, and which Dr. Redden actually talked about was, well, maybe it wasn't Dr. Redden. Somebody talked about it, was the camera vision grading. You know, did this quality grade improve because we went to vision grading, the camera data? I think it does a better job, yes, but it sure didn't count for all 12% of these cattle grading prime in that particular week. So ultrasound has played a significant role in actually determining marbling and changing that from a genetic standpoint. Now, let's talk a little bit about what we should be doing in the industry and what we're not doing in the industry. So if we can kind of relate this back to sheep and goats, and the previous speaker talked about loin eye depth in relationship to fat thickness. We're doing some early projects now looking at scanning cattle pre-weaning versus weaning versus closer to harvest time. And what we're finding is ultrasound technology does a great job of basically sorting cattle or ranking cattle on ribeye size. Whether you scan them pre-weaning, post-weaning, or any time in between, it does a really good job of estimating. And then that makes sense because the way the growth curve is. That muscle is laid down early on, fat comes late. We're finding that we do we just, not a poor job, but we don't do a great job of ranking these cattle on external fat thickness or marbling, pre-weaning or post-weaning. The closer you get to harvest date, the better we are at predicting fat depots, which again, if you look at the growth curve, that makes sense. That's when that fat is being deposited later in that phase of their life. So it does a better job. I can remember scanning some sheep with Dr. Dan Waldron back in, gosh, that would probably been in the probably mid 1990s probably. And we were scanning some very fat Rambouillet rams. So I know that fat can be deposited in sheep pretty early as well. But I wonder if we see the same phenomenon going on in the sheep industry in muscle ranking versus fat depots using ultrasound. And again, I'm not sure, and I'm looking forward to the next presentation where I find out when you guys are actually scanning these animals, what timeline you're doing that. Now, in the image I've got up here, this is where the Ultrasound Guidelines Council has let us down. This is where our technology, our industry has let us down, and they have not let us move forward with some technologies that are out there. This happens to be a technology that's been around probably for 10 years now. It automatically interprets images at shoot side. And if you can see the red line that's going around this loin eye muscle or ribeye muscle, it does a really good job because I hand drew this with the green. So when you look at the green, looks very much like what the computer did in the red. All I did was we had to collect the image, hit one button, send it to the software, and it automatically gives you the square inches, or 11.5 square inches of ribeye, 0.12 inches of fat. Automatically, it gives that to you. It's definitely looking for some things in that image, but we can train this computer to interpret that image without human error. Unfortunately, the labs are not accepting this. We've got one lab that uses it or can use it, and the other two will not use it. But to me, if we all went to this, then we take the human eye out of interpreting these images. Plus, it would take out what I'll call lab bias in these particular, and it would also make technicians a lot better technician. Because if you see everything that's in that image there, the longissimus muscles, the costorum muscle, and if you look at this little, what we call the vertebral bump there at the bottom of that ribeye, kind of where you guys are probably measuring loin eye depth. When we get that in that image, this computer can pick it up. The software is smart enough to know that's the bottom of the ribeye muscle. Again, the industry's done a terrible job of actually utilizing this technology that's available in advancing the breed associations. This is what it would look like for intramuscular fat. Again, the red box, it was placed automatically. And if we changed it, we might move it up slightly and to the right in the green box. But again, it's pretty darn accurate, and it does a really good job at call this in 2.2%, 2.72% intramuscular fat. Again, you can do this at shoot side, on a set of fat cattle at the feedlot level, on a set of seed stock cattle, turn it right into the breed associations. Unfortunately, it's not being allowed to be used other than with one breed association. This one is the rump fat measurement, where we again looked at the gluteus medius and biceps femoris muscles, where they come together. We measure a fat level. And this again is one that's very automated, can be easy to do. Again, I wish that beef cattle industry would take this by the horns and go, but the industry seems to be struggling with it. Even the U.S. Beef Breeds Council struggles with it because they think that it has to go to a centralized lab and to be interpreted by an outside source. But these are the same people that allow us, anybody, to take a weight on a calf that was born, or a weaning weight, or a yearling weight. They allow cattlemen to turn in other measures that have to be, I don't know, can be somewhat subjective too, but it just seems odd that that's what they're doing. All right, what's new on the horizon? I'm pretty excited about some of the new technologies that are out there, and specifically for sheep, goats, pigs. There are some new units out there, the butterfly unit, which you see here. This is a little handheld unit that works off of your iPhone. I believe it will go from a 5 megahertz to 7.5 megahertz. As you can see, it doesn't have the width needed for ribeye area and cattle. But man, for sheep and goats, I just think it would be an awesome piece of equipment to actually use. So my recommendation, if I would love to do some research projects with these on some sheep and goats, or help someone else do some of these projects. That unit there, I believe, is $3,000 is what you pay for that unit. And then there's probably a royalty that you pay monthly, I think, on this one. But much, much less expensive than what we're finding in some of the old technologies we're using in the beef industry. Here's another one that's out there. This one is actually Bluetooth, has no wires connected to it at all. And this is the Clarius unit. Another one that I plan to get my hands on and actually do this in some sheep and goats. Again, it's a pretty simple measurement if you're just going to be looking at depth. If you're getting a fat measurement and a loin eye depth, I think it'd be really, really neat. This unit costs $4,000 and it does not have any royalties attached to it at all. I believe both of these units have a 3-year warranty on these particular units, and they update softwares that you do not have to pay for as long as you've got this unit. So that's some of the new things that are coming on that I think are really, really neat that could be used in your industry. And I'll finish up and probably get us back on time, hopefully. If we look at the beef industry and how ultrasound has been utilized, we've done a great job. I'm not saying we haven't. The associations that we formed and currently have UGC, they've done a really, really good job of keeping us between the ditches and kind of in the middle of the road and making sure that we're making progress for cattlemen across the United States and worldwide, matter of factly. But again, I still criticize us for not taking the newest technologies that are out there and doing a better job of advancing based on, and then driving prices down, because we can drive prices down, then I think we're going to have more sheep and goats and pigs and other things scanned. But I just think it's hurt our technology in the end. That I'm going to quit. I'll stop share, hopefully. Turn it back to Dr. Redden.
Thank you. That was really good. A lot to digest in a short amount of time, but we appreciate you coming on and sharing some of that information with us and presenting some of the history of these things in the beef industry and maybe even some opportunities to do things different that might be a bit better. So I like that idea. So thanks for coming on. For the sake of time, we're going to switch to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Chris Schauer. He received his bachelor's and MS degree in animal science from North Dakota State and got a PhD in ruminant nutrition from Oregon State in 2003. I believe his advisor there grew up in Texas. So you got a little bit of a link here. And he is currently the director of the Hettinger Research and Extension Center and adjunct professor in the Department of Animal Science at NDSU. His research interests are nutritional management of grazing livestock, improving reproductive efficiency, and nutritional management of cattle and sheep, and grazing strategies to improve the ecological and economic sustainability of livestock production in the southwestern region of North Dakota. Chris has received over 7.8 million in extramural funding and authored or co-authored 46 refereed journal publications and 99 proceedings and abstracts. I think you need to get your stuff together, Chris, to make that 199. Just seems like you're one short of, reaching a milestone. He has served as a major professor of 9 masters and 5 PhD students who have successfully defended their thesis or dissertation. His outreach interests include technical training for the evaluation of carcass, ultrasound, and sheep, given what he's talking about today, shearing and wool management, and sheep management schools throughout North Dakota and the Northern Great Plains. He currently serves as the chairman for the NSIP technical subcommittee for carcass ultrasound. Chris, his wife Rhonda, and their 5 children also raise registered NSIP poly-pay sheep and are active in 4-H, FFA, and Boy Scouts. So, Chris, thanks for being here today, and we look forward to your presentation and you sharing your experience and the dedication that you've put towards this technology in the sheep industry. So, Chris, take it away.
Thanks, Reed. Can you see my screen and hear me?
I can.
Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for the opportunity to present today. And I'm coming to you as the chair of the NSIP Carcass Ultrasound Training Committee. And I'm going to hop around through a couple different topics that I think will tie in nice to what some of our other presenters have talked about today, and maybe tie in some loose ends and some similarities and differences between the beef industry. And taking a step back to Jake's talk and talking about an EBV or an estimated breeding value in the sheep industry, we're really looking at it, getting a genetic value of that animal that is calculated from its own performance data, as well as its sire and its dam lines and their performance and relatives. And one of the things that Jake hit on, and I'm going to hit on a couple different times, so I put it in this slide as well, is talking about contemporary means. When we talk about EBVs and NSIP, the absolute data is important. It's very important, but especially when we look at carcass data, and the previous presenter talked about it as well, contemporary means, especially differences between technicians, become very important with carcass ultrasound. And so rankings versus biggest and smallest. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as the presentation goes on. But an EBV can be used within your own flock, but it also can be used across flocks. And while this isn't an NSIP EBV presentation, it's important to remember that if you're an isolated flock within NSIP, your comparisons are going to be more important within your own flock until you've connected your flocks with the rest of the breed, and it can give you a chance to have some cross-flock EBVs. So within NSIP, what carcass traits are measured? And I thought I'd throw the growth traits up there as well, because when you look at the actual input screen for Pedigree Master, the carcass traits are all tied to the performance traits or the weight gain traits. So we can collect birth weight, weaning weight, maternal weaning weight's obviously another trait, but post-weaning weight, yearling weight, hogget weight, which would be about 1.5 years old. And all those different weights, we have the ability to enter carcass traits in. And I'll talk about the timing in the next slide, but the carcass traits that we can enter, and Jake talked about this as well, was loin eye muscle depth and fat depth. We do not have the ability to enter loin eye muscle area, but it's still a very important trait in the sheep industry because it's an important marketing trait, and the vast majority of our producers, especially those not in NSIP, are still looking at loin eye muscle area is what they understand. They know what a 2.5-inch loin eye looks like. They know what a 4.5-inch loin eye looks like, but they may not know what a 17-millimeter depth loin eye looks like. And so when we talk about the traits we're going to collect for our producers, eye muscle depth and fat depth are definitely needed for NSIP, but we need to continue to look at loin eye area at the bare minimum so that our producers can make that link between depth and area, and also maybe where we're going in the future with the data entry for NSIP. So going back to those weights, we can collect carcass data at all those potential weighing time points. The weaning weight for NSIP is 42 to 90 days, post-weaning weight 91 to 150, early post-weaning, 151 to 304, and then yearling. However, that doesn't mean that's the time points we should collect that data. Some data that was put together largely in Montana using Targhee and also some terminal sires, looked at when we should collect carcass data. And that would be based on the growth curve for those respective breeds. So looking at a range type breed, which would be a Rambouillet or a Targhee, or a terminal and dual purpose type breeds, maybe Suffolk and Hamps and Dorsets as well. And when we look at our earlier maturing rams or lambs, we'd want to do it earlier in their growth curve. And the recommendation based on the work in Montana State was 91 to 150 days of age, or about 150 pounds. When we look at our range breeds, which there's a couple layers to when we say range breeds, extensive production conditions such as in the Western range, but also the breed types of Rambouillet and Targhee, and maybe putting a range race Polypay or even a Columbia in there, depending on how you're raising those Columbias. They're a little bit framier sheep. They kind of sit in the middle of when you should be able to do that. But I would put the Columbia on the range breed side for where I live. And the recommendation is 151 to 304 days, but really towards the tail end of that 304 days, almost up to a year of age. About 190 to 200 pounds is the targeted weight that we'd be looking at for scanning those. So we're going to collect the rest of those weights, but getting in at that post-weaning weight at about 150 days of age for the terminal sire type and range breeds, maybe at 190 pounds. We talk about hair sheep. There has not been a lot of work done. I would put them more into the terminal and dual purpose categories until additional work's been done, but probably targeting that even lighter than 150 pounds. But that day of age, maybe that 100 to 120 day of age would be my gut recommendation when we think about the way hair sheep are growing and maybe the way they're marketed, but catching that growth curve before it plateaus. We've looked at some images a little bit, but from the sheep perspective, this is a cattle image that I'm showing, but from the sheep perspective, there's some things that we struggle with as an industry. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the way we trace and the way we put animals into NSIP. And our technicians trace their own images. Unlike the beef industry, they do not go to a certified lab. You can use a certified lab to trace your images, but as an industry, we just haven't felt that we were mature enough. And the previous speaker also talked about the cost. It costs the same amount of time to trace an image if it's a beef or a sheep image, yet we would indicate that the sheep images, we're going to have 7 times as many on an animal unit basis. And so that cost is really a struggle. So at NSIP, we've stayed with the concept that if you're certified to scan, you are the tracer. If you would like to send it off to a certified lab, that's fine. You can do that, but that's going to be an extra cost to that producer. So in the sheep industry, we're looking at the same image, or we're looking at the cattle industry. One of the things we probably struggle with a little bit more, and it's largely due to the size and scale of the animal, is making sure technicians do cut off the trace of that loin eye at the longissimus dorsi muscle and not get the longissimus costarum. I've seen a lot of image quality problems, not being able to pick up the distal boundary. And some of that comes down to technology. I'll talk about the different ultrasound machines in a little bit, but making sure we got our landmarks of the intercostal muscles, and then getting that medial boundary and not including the spinalis dorsi in that trace, and making sure that we're reflecting that acorn fat. So while the image is the same, it's obviously magnitude smaller than it is in the cattle industry. And we're looking at more a 2.5 to maybe a 5-inch loin eye instead of the cattle size. So when we look at that, and we look at loin eye depth, which is required by NSIP, just like cattle, we're measuring between the 12th and 13th rib. So I'll go back a slide, and we're measuring that depth at its deepest point. We have to be careful not to be moving that line laterally, that we're getting a very vertical image of depth. And then we're measuring that fat depth on the very same image. So unlike the cattle industry, we're going to collect 1 image, not 3. And this is assuming we're using a linear probe. But so we're looking at fat depth, loin eye depth, and we're going to talk about tracing. So while LambPlan only accepts depth, not area, I think it's important that we talk about some of the good things about doing that and some of the problems that I've seen in our industry. As Jake indicated, depth may have lower technician variability and it may be easier to collect. But I do think that we've had less research done that evaluates what effects depth has on carcass yield, especially as we look across breeds and look at different breed types, range, extensive range conditions, terminal sires, and then perhaps hair sheep as well. and maybe even looking at more double muscled type animals, I don't know that we've really evaluated to the same level as the past on how depth impacts carcass yield. However, that is the trait that Lamb Plan in Australia allows us to enter. So at this point, that's what we're doing. One of the problems I've seen with this concept is the utilization of rectal probes versus linear probes. You can collect a depth image with a rectal probe as long as you know where your landmarks are. And as we look back on that image, when you use a rectal probe or a convex probe, you're not going to get that same image quality, and making sure that we are in the right location is one of my concerns. We have done quite a bit of training in the past 3 or 4 years. I have a future slide that says I think we've trained over 88 people in Carcass ultrasound with an 80% success rate, and I have yet to have one that was able to certify using a rectal probe or a convex probe versus a linear probe. So just because you can do it maybe doesn't mean we should do it. And sometimes the reason that those aren't passing is because we're not preparing our animal correctly because the producer didn't want them shorn. And I'll talk about that in a future slide of why we still need to prepare the animal the same way, whether we're using a rectal probe or a linear probe, to make sure we have good image quality. Regardless, our producers are probably going to want depth and area. And my preference is always to collect both. NSIP is going to require depth, so we should collect it. And if the producer wants area, we should collect it as well. However, we do have some equations that if you collect eye muscle depth and want to convert it to area, that is something that you can do. I would rather see people doing that than collecting loin eye area in inches and then converting it to depth. So at the bare minimum, eye muscle depth, and then fat depth, collected in millimeters for NSIP, and then if time allows and the producer is willing to do it, to collect loin eye muscle area as well, so that we're not using any equations to estimate. We're already making an estimation on carcass yield through the technology. Then to estimate an estimate adds additional error into our estimation. So we talked a little bit about the cattle industry already on what not to collect. As the previous speaker, Tommy, indicated, we don't collect rump fat. We utilize fat depth at the 12th and 13th rib as the only indicator of fat depth. And that could be an area of future research to look at. But at this point, that's not something that NSIP has incorporated, or even the general purebred sheep industry. And we also do not collect intramuscular fat, which, as the last presenter indicated, this image 3, where we'd be looking down across that loin eye to collect that intramuscular fat, that's more similar to the image that we're seeing off of rectal probes and convex probes to estimate loin eye depth. And our certification process is not set up to evaluate that as a technique for getting loin eye depth. It could be changed in the future to do that, but our current certification process is based on, the original technology of having that traditional loin eye image from a linear probe. So once that data is collected, we do not go back to the breed associations at this point. There are some breed associations that have looked at entering data into NSIP and maybe have looked at having a carcass technician that could address their breed. Those are, I think we've heard some of the strengths and the weaknesses from Dr. Perkins on how that's worked in the beef industry. It is the breeder's responsibility to submit their own data or utilize a hired manager to submit their data. We do require that they utilize an NSIP certified technician, and that data is then collected chute side. And if that technician has image capture software, they can trace them later. If they don't have image capture software, they can trace them on site. I do it on site. I think a lot of the people that are doing sheep and only sheep are tracing them on site or saving them within the ultrasound, but not using an image capture software. And some of that just comes down to the extra cost of having the extra displays and the extra image capture software versus simply tracing it themselves. If you want to collect carcass data, but you don't have a certified NSIP technician, but you have somebody on the cattle industry that's willing to do it, that is the loophole that we've put into our process that allows a non-NSIP certified technician to then submit the data to somebody like the Cup Lab, a certified laboratory, to get the results. And that way they wouldn't have to be certified if you're in an area that does not have a certified technician. So how do we use that data from within our own flock? And this applies to both NSIP and our non-NSIP producers. Is once again, we need to be thinking about contemporary groups. There's other discussions out there on how to structure your contemporary groups, but I always like to think about it as one RAM turned into 20 U's, and you want to compare that RAM to another RAM. So you'd want to have 40 U's on the place, 2 groups of 20. With each RAM exposed to those 20, those would be a good comparison of contemporary groups. But you wouldn't want to do it in different seasons. You wouldn't want to have one of those flocks in April and the other flock in January. That becomes not as good of a comparison of contemporary groups. So we want to compare our carcass data within contemporary groups. We have to be careful about comparing across years, especially if you have changed technicians or if those technicians have changed hardware and or software. So once again, getting back to rankings and maybe removing the outliers as your goal within your flock. Can you remove the really small scanning lambs first? And then maybe be thinking about the bottom 30% of those lambs and looking at those rankings. Just like every other genetic trait that I think the cattle and the hog industry, and as well as the sheep industry, if you start single trait selecting for one trait, you're going to have unintended consequences on your other traits. And Jake talked about the impact that selecting for loin eye can have on different traits. And I think it's very, very important to remember that, especially we've seen producers, especially on the terminal sire side, into chasing the quote unquote largest one, that monster. And we want to chase that monster. Well, that monster could have had a bad scan by a technician. It still might be the biggest, but it might not be quite as big as you thought it was. So looking at rankings, looking at the top 70%, and what are your breed goals? I'm a polypay breeder, and I like to joke, and it's not a joke, it's true. I haven't carcass scanned a single one of my rams, and I've been doing it since 2008. And our #1 breed goal is not carcass traits. If I feel like I get my flock to where I want it maternally, then I'll probably scan and maybe take out the bottom 10% or 15%. If your breed goal is terminal sire and carcass traits, then that's obviously a trait that we need to be measuring. But if we're going to measure it in some of the more maternal breeds, make sure we balance that selection pressure appropriately. So what is that certification process? And Dr. Perkins talked about it a little bit on the beef side. We require the attendance of a carcass ultrasound school. Our carcass ultrasound committee has about 6 of us on it, and we try to help organize those schools. We did a good job 2 or 3 years ago. We got a grant, and we had 6 schools across the country. And I'll talk about some upcoming schools shortly. The requirement is that after the completion of at least a 2-day carcass ultrasound school, on day 3, then you scan 20 lambs twice for both prediction and repeatability. Loin eye depth and back fat thickness are required. And if the technician wants to measure area, I'll also do the statistics on that, but we don't have a threshold for area. On the right-hand side here, I probably haven't updated the beef cattle side or the swine side in a while, but these are our requirements for loin eye depth for NSIP. For standard error prediction is 0.15 and standard error predictability is 0.15. Underneath that is lamb plan, and lamb plan would be the Australian requirements. So their requirements are a little bit more strict. And if you are in a breed that's trying to submit data to Australia, we can submit your certification standards to Australia to see if they'll accept you, but you're going to have to be at the certification standards that they require, not what NSIP requires if you're a breed that has some interaction with Australia. Back fat, once again, 0.075 for both standard error prediction and standard error of repeatability. To get that data, we can use 2 different routes, 2 reference technicians, which would be somebody established as a technician, has been certified for a while and is scanning lambs, or in the absence of 2 reference technicians at that school, carcass measurements, so collection of all 20 of those lambs. We can do that either way. They're required to recertify every 5 years, and then we list those scanners on the NSIP website. If you have a breeder that wants to submit to Lamb Plan, as I said, we can submit your certification data to Australia to see if they approve it. And we also have the ability as a committee to maybe extend somebody's, as the beef industry is starting to do, on a case-by-case situation. If somebody can't recertify this year, but they've been established scanners, they can appeal that to the committee. And after Reed and I and Allison and a lot of other people ran 6 schools from across the country, that was one of the big questions that came out, is who should become certified. And Reed talked a bit about this at the beginning. Training for the value of Carcass ultrasound is different than training technicians. And as Dr. Perkins indicated, it's $20,000 to $25,000 to get up and running currently, on a newer machine. So we need to be targeting currently certified scanners in the beef and or pork industry, or vets and vet techs that already own a machine, or partnering with a vet that has a machine to see if you can rent it. If you just want to buy the probe still may cost you $2,500 to $5,000, but it's cheaper than the $15,000 machine. I think that needs to be our target area for getting new technicians scattered across the country. If you want to do this and 100% of your use is going to be Carcass ultrasound and sheep, you're going to have to cover a very wide region, or have a breed association that maybe is footing part of that bill, because it's going to be very difficult to cash flow just sheep Carcass ultrasound without either doing cattle as well or using that ultrasound machine for other veterinary work. So that, as I alluded to, when we ran those 6 schools, we had 55 out of 68 people certified. So that's 81%. That was across 21 states. Out of those 55 that certified, off the top of my head, probably a quarter of them were already certified. They just need to be recertified. But we probably still saw 30 to 35 of those that had never touched an ultrasound machine and borrowed one at the school that were able to certify after 3 days. Does that mean that they're great or just good? Well, they were good enough that day to certify, but they're going to have to continue to get lambs underneath them and to continue to scan on a continued basis to keep that accuracy and that repeatability at an acceptable rate. And so that's one of our concerns if we have people that have certified that aren't going to go ahead and keep scanning, that just because you're certified doesn't mean that you're still competent 4 years later at the tail end of your certification. So if you are looking at becoming Carcass ultrasound certified, that's obviously through NSIP, but that's not your only clients that would utilize the service. So NSIP producers, which we've talked about, but purebred producers, which is still a very large section of the sheep industry on the purebred side, are not on NSIP, but they still want Carcass data. I do some county and state fair projects. It's not a large cash flow, but it is a good education for our youth. And then working with researchers and extension staff, either on the demonstration side at a field day or on actually collecting data. And what I've seen across the university systems is, especially in the Northern Great Plains, we do not have a lot of technicians and researchers, especially in sheep, that are certified to collect data. That doesn't mean they couldn't collect data, but they haven't gone through a certification school. So as an outside contractor, I do think there's an opportunity in partnering with a university or somebody that's doing sheep research if they need a technician, but they don't have one on site. And one of the last slides, what can you do as a breeder to help the technician? And this is often the overlooked side of just like wool quality or any other trait that we want to have somebody come onto our operation. What do we need to do as a breeder to make it easier for the technician and improve the accuracy of our data? And honestly, this seems like it shouldn't be something that's a big complaint, but it is. Be willing to allow them to shear between the 12th and 13th rib. Just like cattle and wool's just as bad. We have to get down to the skin, and many purebred producers don't want that either the hair on a hair sheep or the wool on a wool sheep to be taken away because they feel that during marketing that's not eye appealing. It's very difficult to impossible to get an image. If the beef industry requires them to be clipped and blown out, we have pushed to require that, but that has not made the standards that they have to be clipped and blown out to be scanned. I will tell you that if you're doing it with a linear probe, that it's nearly impossible to get an image if they aren't clipped with a 9 or a 13 tooth comb. Clean, dry sheep, just like a shear, just like the carcass side of the cattle industry, we need to have clean and dry. Have a chute with drop down sides, so you have a little bit of wiggle room to manipulate the probe, and have a warm room. Not a lot of Dorper sheep up in North Dakota. There are some. So, the Dorper industry probably doesn't struggle with this as much as we do in North Dakota, but vegetable oil which we use as the medium between the probe and the animal, doesn't flow well at minus 35°F. It always seems that's when our producers want to do it, and it's in a cold barn. So having some place where at the bare minimum, we can keep the vegetable oil warm, and ideally being able to be closer to 60 degrees or 50 to 70 degrees where we're doing our scanning. So in summary, Carcass ultrasound can be utilized to improve carcass merit, but don't chase the monsters. There's no trophy for that one biggest. And looking at rankings is far more important than finding the biggest one, and removing your bottom 30% is probably more important than finding the biggest one. Utilize contemporary group rankings. Be careful about comparing technicians and comparing across time. Equipment is expensive. Encourage those currently with equipment to become certified or develop a large trade area as a technician. And finally, as producers, prepare your sheep correctly for your scanning technician. It'll make the process quicker and also more accurate. With that, we do have some schools that are starting to get planned as people come out of COVID hibernation. Texas looks like they're doing a school with Reed May 4th and 5th. Idaho is talking about one July 7th through the 9th. Montana had one scheduled for the trailing of the sheep last year in October that we had to cancel, and we're looking at doing that again. That's with Brent Rader. And Missouri tentatively has one that's being looked at for June. So there are some schools coming up across the country. It's a pretty good distribution of locations, actually. And if you want to propose a school to be offered somewhere, that's something that you would contact me directly, and we'd see if you could find a trainer first, and then ultrasound techs to be the technicians, or at least get the carcass data. And if you are looking for certified scanners, nsip.org are where those are listed. And with that, I'd entertain any questions and allow you guys to open it up to your producer panel.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate all that information. I see that COVID must have run your barber off.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good stuff. I think for the sake of time, we'll just move right into our panelists here. So hopefully we have them on and they're able to get their mic going. If we might, we'll just start with Lynn Farmeyer. Lynn is the president or chairman for NSIP. And looks like we've got maybe some slides here.
Yeah, I hope so.
Good. Well, I've misplaced your intro, so I'm going to forego that. But Lynn has been extremely dedicated to implementing these technologies within the sheep industry. He's a Katahdin breeder from Missouri. And I'm sure you're gonna like maybe the boots on the ground approach that Lynn may be able to share with us this afternoon. So take it away.
Okay, well, I was going to share my video, but it's probably good that you can't see me. But if you can see my slides and hear me, that'll be good. And you know, as a producer, following all of these people with PhDs, I'm always nervous that one of my slides isn't going to match up with what they say. And actually, I think we're going to match pretty well here. So, so that's good. But I want to talk just a little bit about my reasons on why I am, why we're scanning. And this has already been talked about a little bit. There's a little bit of a negative correlation between the weight traits and muscling. And I mean, I agree with what Chris said. You know, polypays are a maternal breed. I consider Katahdins to be a maternal breed. But as I'm selecting for maternal traits and fecal egg count traits and all those other traits, I don't want to lose the muscling. And oftentimes, if you don't select for something, you lose it. And as we select for growth traits, I don't want to lose the muscling. So I'll show here in just a little bit of graph that I use that kind of illustrates maybe why I'm doing this and how I select for that. Then there's also a slightly negative correlation between the growth traits and muscling as well. So, and I've got a couple slides on this last bullet point here. You know, in high school, I did a lot of 4-H and FFA judging, and not on a national scale by any means, but we had teams that would go to state contests. And you know, quite honestly, I cannot tell the difference between the depth differences of hair, fat, and muscle on a live animal. And the scanner does not lie, but my eyes will. And we'll touch on this last point just a little bit as well. So on this slide, this is just a scatter plot plotting eye muscle depth and weight. This is on as EBVs. And so I hope the point that's made here is, you know, even on a trait that's negatively correlated, you can come up into this area where I have this, the ellipse or the oval, and there's animals that kind of break the pattern. And so again, not promoting single trait selection by any means. I use indexes a lot, but this just illustrates that you can select animals that kind of break the norm, break the correlation, if that's what you need to do for the traits that you're selecting for. So, and again, I do this for maternal traits and eye muscle depth as well. And again, in my own personal flock, I'm not selecting necessarily to have a great rate of increase in eye muscle depth because I'm selecting for maternal traits first. I just don't want to lose. Honestly, I've had the privilege of being down at San Angelo for the AgriLife Sheep and Goat Expo the last several years. And, you know, I talked to a lot of the producers down in Texas that are converting irrigated cotton fields into irrigated pasture, and they're expanding their sheep flocks. And I understand Dorpers are huge down there, but, you know, I think we can take, and this is just a little bit of a shameless plug maybe, but, you know, take a Katahdin that has some decent muscle and some decent growth and use that to create a ewe flock, and then come back over the top with a Dorper for your carcass traits. And, you know, it's going to look like a Dorper when you sell it. And, but yet you get the hybrid vigor of having a crossbred female that, you know, will help your number of lambs weaned. And so you want to make sure you're buying whichever animal, whatever breed it is, to create a F1 hybrid in your female flock, your ewe flock. You know, you want to make sure you're selecting animals that have some muscling as well. So this has been touched on, and I honestly did not realize you had to clip wool sheep, but you definitely have to clip hair sheep. The hair follicles are hollow, they contain air, so the ultrasound waves will not pass through those. I actually use the Premier 1 super surgical blades or the Lister surgical blades. On my hair sheep, I almost need to, if I don't nick the skin once in a great while, I'm not getting close enough. You almost have to shave the skin. And there's differences in the hair coat on Katahdins, and you learn that pretty fast, but it's hard to not clip close enough. And just a management practice that I do, again, trying to just keep the guy that's coming to do my scanning, get the, you know, I try to keep the technician happy. I will weigh and clip all the sheep the day before, and then we have a clipper there chute side, and we just one more pass just before it's time to scan that animal. And that way I always have an animal ready for the scanner so I don't slow them down. Here's just a picture of me clipping one of the lambs the day before. And then this is the slide I think maybe is the most telling for hair sheep. And I imagine Dorpers are similar. And this is why you can't tell the difference between when you look at an animal live, there's a huge difference here in the depth of the hair coat on these three animals. And until you get the clipper on there and clip that off, you can't really tell that. And I tell the story and kind of joke about it that the first time that the scanner came, I used Dallas McDermott from Iowa, but you know, I'd brag on this ram coming through and say, boy, Dallas, this is a good one. He'd just shake his head and say, no, Lynn, it's not, it's just fat. And then the next one would come through and I'd say, boy, this is another good one. He'd just shake his head and he said, you were just looking at the hair coat. There's no muscle on this guy. And then, you know, this mediocre one would come through and Dallas would say, well, Lynn, why didn't you like this one? I said, well, you know, he looks nice, but he's just kind of average. And he says, well, this is the one that's got the most muscle of any of the ones we've scanned so far today. So, and then a good friend of mine, Robert Walker, was here a couple of years ago to help me. And Dallas basically did the same thing to Robert. He just embarrassed us both. But again, the scanner doesn't lie. And I think it's pretty obvious from these three pictures that it's hard to separate out what our eyes are seeing from what the scanner sees. And that's probably the main reason why we've been scanning since 2011, I think. And so we got a lot of data in the system. And again, it's not the only trait that it's not even the main trait that I select for, but it is one of the traits that's in the selection criteria. So Reed, I hope that kind of helps just a little bit from a producer perspective. And I know you got a couple others that need to talk, but here's my contact information. I'm always willing to answer the phone and talk. And I appreciate all the speakers that have come before me. Reed and Chris have both done a lot of work for NSIP, and I appreciate their efforts and keeping us moving forward. So with that, I'll quit the screen share.
All right. Thanks, Lynn. Appreciate that. It's good to hear from someone who's been doing it for quite some time. I suspect that we might have some questions for you here in a minute, but let's make sure we get through all of our presenters before we run out of time. Next, we have Mr. Cody Heinke. Cody, I don't believe has any slides. Maybe he can turn his video on and talk to us a little bit. Cody's been quite involved in this, I believe, was at one of the first ultrasound certifications. He has some degrees in meat science, runs a Shropshire NSIP flock personally, and works for Nyman Ranch, which you may know of their pork or beef, but they also have a lamb division as well. So has experience on the animal and the end product side. So Cody, are you there?
I'm here. Do you see me?
I can. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
I said turn my camera on. I had it on. I wasn't sure.
All right.
Yeah, Reed never gave us direction to put together a slideshow, so I didn't. But that's all right. I guess my history with ultrasound goes back to when I was in grad school, 2002 to 2005. I specifically did ultrasound on lambs, did a lot of serial scanning as lambs grew. So we kind of looked at some growth curves of the University of Wisconsin flocks, Polypays, Hampshires, and we did a few of the wool breeds as well. But then like with lambs that we would, there was another direct marketer that I worked with, and I was able to, in the first year, did a lot of scanning of lambs, and then two days later go down and ultrasound, or excuse me, measure the carcasses to look at accuracy. So I'm a firm believer that we're good with the loin depth measurement. It's fun conversations that Chris and I have quite often. But I'm through my research that I did when I was back in grad school, I was able to look at improvements in accuracy and repeatability over time, just with the additional training that I have. After grad school, I moved out to Du Bois and worked for that summer doing ultrasound work at the sheep station, just kind of in advance of the terminal Sire project that they did. My flock has had, I joined NSIP in 2007, but I did have ultrasound scans on my lambs going back to about 2003 or 4. And there's another flock that I worked with in California who has a lot of those ultrasound measurements. You know, with the Shropshires, I kind of view them as a multi-purpose breed. Historically, they have been good maternal sheep and good terminal sheep. And I think, you know, one thing that we didn't talk about much today, but I think using ultrasound, you know, Lynn was mentioning how he kind of has things he first selects for. Like with the way I match up my EBVs and my breeding plans, I've got a pretty tight genetic flock. Right now, I'm incorporating in some New Zealand genetics into the flock. So there's some restrictions there as far as how I do my breeding plans. But in general, I'm usually looking to, you know, pay attention to maternal traits, but put a ram that's more of a high muscle ram onto a high growth ewe and vice versa. Some complementary breeding there. So I'm not really going too far in any one direction. And one thing that I have noticed is the Carcass Plus index that, you know, Jake mentioned when he was talking earlier, I believe, that does put a pretty big influence on negative fat. But that's not something, you know, I feel like I raise a moderate framed terminal sire breed. So I'm not looking to get too large and I'm not looking to get too lean either. And I do think that, you know, it's something that I'm shying away from a little bit, is that a bigger negative fat number within the Shropshire. You can't compare the EBVs across all breeds, but at least within the Shropshire breed, like, I don't want to get any more than a -3 on fat. So yeah, I didn't have anything other than rambling to say. I guess I could take questions, or Reed, if you have any questions for the group later, I can do that too.
Let's hold off till the end, and then we can fire away, and you all can jump in here at the end. But so next on our producer panel is Miss Kristen Bieber from Montana, raises targies. They market a fair number of rams into the Western state producers and has been involved in ultrasound for quite a few years. Kristen, are you there?
Yep, I think I'm here.
All right, good. Thanks for being here. Would you please kind of give us your perspective on ultrasound and what it means to your flock and goals and marketing rams?
Okay. We, like Reed said, we raise targies. We have a mix of commercial and registered animals that are on NSIP. And Rodney Cott and Lisa Serber kind of spearheaded getting the targies going on ribeye scanning, I think about 12 years ago. Reed could probably correct me on that if I'm wrong, because I think he was around for that. And it was something that the targies hadn't really looked at prior to that. Most of us targie producers do consider our sheep to be fine wool, dual purpose, you know, decent maternal animals. But we hadn't really looked at muscling aside from, well, that's a narrow animal or that's not. And so when Rodney and Lisa brought in the ribeye scanning, there were several of us, mainly Montana Ramsdale producers, that got on board with it. And it's been very interesting to see how it's changed the look of our animals, with focusing not really heavily on ribeye, but taking it into account in our selection. We definitely have noticed that we're seeing broader based animals than we had previous to ribeye scanning. And we're also getting more moderate sized animals with a little bit more emphasis on, you know, here's this really monstrous ram, but he's got a smaller or a lower EBV for ribeye than this more moderate sized animal. And we kind of tend to go towards the moderate sized animal, which as a producer that deals with a lot of rams, I don't mind not dealing with really large rams, and neither do my sheep shearers. But some of the observations, and this is just solely from my flock and my dad's flock that I help with, some of the things we've noticed with using ribeye scans, not necessarily that this is the EBV, but it's kind of a side effect. is, like I said, we have seen the overall size, mature size of our animals get a little bit smaller. We're running fewer really large ewes. We're running more moderate sized ewes, but we have seen the overall capacity in our ewes increase. We've noticed we've had fewer ruptures from carrying heavy sets of twins since using the ribeye scan. And that's, you know, again, it's just my observations, but we started seeing the difference when we started paying attention to ribeye. And I think it's just, we're breeding for a broader based animal based off of a larger ribeye scan. The other interesting thing that we've noticed is, I think it was brought up in one of the previous presentations, is that the ewes that we have, because we scan our ewes as well, the ewes that scan as a larger ribeye tend to be our easier keeper ewes. They tend to not shell out at 5 years old. They tend to stay in the flock to 6, 7, 8 years old. And they tend to have lambs that are easier keepers. And so, I mean, that's a nice side effect. I don't select heavily off of ribeye. I use it mainly to make sure that if I have a ewe that's got a poor ribeye, she goes with a good ribeye ram, and vice versa. We haven't really seen a huge impact on our fleeces with it at all. But we do notice that the larger ribeye rams tend to not have extraordinary staple lengths. But overall, it's definitely something that I believe has improved our sheep a lot. And it's, if I can add more muscling with a scan, well, I can't actually add it just with scanning, but using the scan results and making breeding decisions based off of that. If I can add more muscling, I mean, it's a real no-brainer to use. And I think that's about all I had as far as thoughts on it.
Thanks, Kristen. Appreciate that and sharing your experiences. So we're towards the end of the program here, but we have some extra time to get some questions in. Brent, are you able to?
Yeah, I think I enabled everybody, should be able to open their mics now.
Okay. All right. So if we have some questions for any of our speakers, or just some random questions, and I'll assign a speaker or assign someone to take a shot at it, or ask someone voluntold, kind of a deal. So questions from the audience.
And if you find you can't unmute for some reason, raise your hand and I'll unmute you. But I think I enabled unmuting.
So what probe for an Aloca do we need?
Chris, you want to take that one?
Sure. For the Loca, I mean, you can use both the cattle 17 centimeter probe or the shorter hog probe. Either will work. And you need a standoff for it. I used to use an Aloca. I now have an Exego, and I really, really like the Exego. That's a shorter probe. That's more the hog size probe, but the 17 centimeter long probe can get a little bit big, especially if you're doing them at the correct weight. If you're looking at 150 pounds or less, that's a pretty big probe. So if you're only going to do sheep and goats, I would go with a smaller probe. But if you're also going to do cattle and you only wanted to buy one probe, you can do them with both. But it's just a little more unwieldy. And especially when you get in kind of those quote unquote slab sided ones, you're teeter-tottering over transverse process so bad. But I've used them all.
But you misunderstood me. Right now I sonogram, I don't know, 2,000 to 3,000 sheep and goats a year. Okay. But I don't do muscle. It's all for pregnancy. Yep. So right now I have nothing but convex probes. I've never even seen the probe y'all were talking about.
Oh, the linear. That's what the keyword.
Linear probe, and I'm looking for what size?
Well, And is Tommy still on? 17 is the cattle. Are you going to do cattle work as well?
Probably not.
I think there's 12. I think that's the other one out there. Don't quote me on the 12, but
if y'all were talking about prices of Alocas, and I didn't give, but I think 3,500 for my Aloca V. But I mean, it's been a few years ago. I mean, of course, I bought it used. I didn't buy it new.
If you can get Tommy hit on this, and he's dead on right. If you can find a used Aloca, you can get them for 3,500 to 5,000, but you can't get a part for one.
Right.
It's going to be fun.
Tommy, it's 12 for the smaller probe, right? 12 centimeters.
Yeah, we use the US 5011, I believe is the number, but it's a 5 megahertz probe used in pigs.
Yep, and that's the one I have for my Exego.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I can jump on Jake's question in the chat if you want.
Yeah, go ahead. I don't see it.
No, I was wondering. I sent you a message earlier and you didn't respond to me. So Jake asks, I have a question for all three panelists. How important are the Carcass measurements EBVs to your RAM customers? And truly it differs, across the board for me. My first goal is selling seed stock, but I probably sell more commercial RAMs than I do seed stock. A lot of my customers are looking for balance. Some of them are looking at EBVs for specific purpose. Rusty Burgett, who is our director for NSIP, when he was running the sheep spooner station, he came through my flock looking to breed. So at Spooner, they raised sheep. He was looking to breed for terminal lambs. He selected for high fat, high muscle, high weaning weight, something very quick to grow, but he could get off there very quickly as well, and something that would take to milk replacer pretty easily. And that's a similar profile, maybe not with the fat influence that some of the hair sheep guys that have bought rams from me are looking for. They're looking for a quick growing terminal sire lamb that's got some meat to it, that produces that butterball type ethnic lamb that they're interested in. So.
Thanks, Cody. Kristen and Lynn, would y'all like to comment on that as well, on your RAM customers? What are they looking for in the data wise, and how does that help market your RAMs?
I'd say that about half of my buyers kind of take note of the ribeye EBV. Some of those guys, it's a very important selection criteria. A lot of our buyers out of Wyoming, it's one of their main EBVs that they look at. And then about the other half, it's nice that you're taking this. We're glad you're paying attention to it, so we don't have to. And so it's really hit or miss. Again, with the fact that the Targies are a wool animal, about half of the buyers, their key is the wool traits, and the other half of the buyers, the key is the muscle and growth traits.
Yeah, I'll just pretty much say ditto to both of those comments. I mean, I wish I had more RAM buyers looking for this trait, but again, kind of in the ethnic market, I think they want the trait, but they're looking at it visually. They want to be able to have a nice butterball lamb that they can take to the sale barn at 70 pounds. And so this isn't the only trait that affects that, but I have had one or two customers that sell into the restaurant market, and they are very interested in this trait. So it really depends on the market that the people are selling into.
Chris, it sounds like you need to start scanning some of your polypays. You're missing out on some marketing opportunity.
I know. I can't afford to buy it for myself, and I won't take university property to my personal flock.
Too honest.
So for those individuals that were talking about crossing, you know, two different breeds and using NSIP, those offspring, you know, that they're selling, are they terminal offspring, or does a new contemporary group need to be created inside of NSIP to track them?
You can't really track a crossbreed. They don't have crossbreed equations built in. So if you put a suffix on a Rambouillet, those offspring, you cannot put the data into the program. As of currently, they're running two different programs, and then Dorpers are actually running the Australian program. So as a point of it, pretty important point here that Chris was making, the standards to get qualified to be a scanner to submit to land plan would have to be made by a scanner that was going to do a Dorper sheet, because it's run with the Australian database. But to the point that those crossbreds is just for commercial production, unless you were crossing within traits, so a Rambouillet and a Targhee, or a Suffolk and a Hampshire. Technically, we still don't know those hybrid vigor effects, but they do run in the same database, so you potentially could get breeding values back for them, but they would be a bit skewed.
Thanks.
If I missed on that one, Cody, you've been involved in NSIP longer than I have, or Lynn. Yeah.
I actually don't know anybody trying to produce an F1 between different breeds and keeping them on NSIP.
I do it.
Of course, Chris does.
My only, go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, that's fine. John Helly has some crossbreds that he runs on NSIP. I believe they're Rambouillet Sam crosses, and he uses it just in his, it's an intraflock comparison. So I think at this point, they're just compared against his Rambouillets. So he kind of can make an estimate on how efficient this cross is. So he can't, if I decided to have a Rambouillet Sam cross experiment here, I couldn't compare them across to Helly's, but he can do it in his own flock and compare them to his Rambouillets. That's the only one that I know of that's running a large number of non-terminal cross in NSIP.
Yeah,
and that's how I do it. And I've got a Rambouillet Polype and a Targhee Polype lines that F1s, F2s, F3s they're on their own. Well, it was similar to the way John Helly's doing
it. Go ahead, Sandy.
Okay, so we've discussed the price on the machines and what we should be using. My question would be, what are they charging? How are they recuperating some of their startup cost?
Kristen, do you want to start there? What does it cost for you to have your ram lambs and ewe lambs scanned?
Well, it's pretty fresh in my memory since Lisa was out here yesterday to scan the rams. Lisa Serber comes out and scans mine and my father's and another producer's in one trip, and she usually charges about $6 a head. Being completely open and honest, she scanned yesterday, I think 140 or 150 head of rams between Dad and I. And then she'd go up and scan another producer that I'm not familiar enough with his operation to know how many. So that's kind of where she's at, but kind of like what Chris mentioned about the distance is Lisa covers pretty much all of Montana to get to scan rams. She covers a large chunk of Wyoming and then the Dakotas as well. So her cost for us as producers is very reasonable. I don't know how she comes out on her end, but I know she scans a pile of sheep.
Lynn?
So my,
No, my situation's similar. I mean, Dallas comes, he has to drive from central Iowa down here, but he always coordinates it. Either going to he scans a lot of show animals, especially in the beef industry. And so I'm flexible on the date. So he can either, oftentimes he's catching me coming from a show, and then there's another sheep producer we coordinate with on his way back up to Iowa. So he's either driving or scanning. He's not spending much time waiting for anybody. And so that helps keep the price down. You just have to be flexible to help him out.
It's almost kind of like shearers, you know, if they have to wrap their travel costs and hotels and things like that in there, it can be a lot per head. And if they can match it up, it's pretty reasonable.
so my next question would be cost efficiency on a commercial herd where my sale barn works highly with me because I produce some of the highest quality sheep that go through their barn. Is it going to be cost efficient for me to invest in this?
So is your question on scanning commercial animals or seed stock?
Both. All my ewes are kept for seed stock, whether they be for me or another breeder that I am starting.
Go ahead, Chris. You sound like you look like you're really
trying to figure out the right answer. Starting on the seed stock on the ram side, I think it's cost effective. I've done quite a few people where they wanted to do their ewe lambs for a couple of years. So it was an investment they put into it. And I've done the same thing with wool. We do wool testing here at the research center as well. And it's not necessarily a long-term thing, but they want to get a handle on where they're at and maybe get rid of their bottom 20% and make that selection pressure for a couple of years on their ewe lambs. If you can get somebody that gets in there for the right price, or you know, if you're up at $10 a head, I don't think it's cost effective. I think it's gonna be tough to get that back unless you know you're gonna have your buyer get you that extra $10 a head because you know that those ewe lambs are a little bit bigger. If you can get somebody in for the $5 to $6 a head, kind of like where a lot of the technicians are at, and get a whole bunch done for a couple of years, that could be cost effective in the long run. Most of my producers that have done that, after 3 or 4 years, they feel like they've accomplished, or at least they've gotten rid of their bottom 20 or 30%, and they'll take some time off from doing it. If you're getting paid for it, then you can maybe make it cost effective. If you're doing it and then just bring them to the sale barn and selling pounds, then I don't think it's cost effective.
Reed, I'd also add, it kind of depends on where you're buying your seed stock from. So there's not a lot of Katahdin breeders that scan, especially in the Midwest. There's a few on the East Coast. So it's hard for me to bring in rams, new rams that have been scanned. So I concentrate more on my ewe flock. I scan my ewe lambs. If I could have a good source of ram lambs that have been scanned, then I probably would not worry as much about scanning my ewe lambs. So it kind of depends on where you're sourcing your seed stock from too.
Wes Patton, I'm glad you could be on. Go ahead.
Hi, Reed. Hey, could Tommy tell us a little bit more about the inexpensive handheld units that he mentioned in passing there? Where are they available? Where are the companies and all that?
Yes, sir. They are available. Butterfly, and there's salesmen all over the United States that sell those units. I'm currently working with the main sales guy that we're trying to get a unit in our hand for 30 days so we can scan some sheep. And see, currently it's a medical unit, but also is being used effectively in equine. So it just has not been tested outside other than equine in the livestock industry, but it looks like it's got a lot of capabilities. So,
okay.
Yeah. And the other one was the Clarius, and it's a bit less expensive, and it is wireless. I really like it, but I haven't gotten far enough in with them that I think I'm going to get a unit in my hand anytime soon, but I'm still working on it.
Okay, thank you. The reason I ask is that some of us need to do some personal work. And also we have the California ram sale where we do 500 head on one day. And the tech is really nice to do that for us. And getting back to the question that someone else had, what is this cost? Including travel and the service itself, he's charging us about $10 a head. And these are for the big commercial rams that we sell at that sale each year.
Well, the previous participant asked, said that he bought a unit for $3,500. I saw one just recently with a Loca 500 for $3,500. And the 5011 units, you can find those probes around very inexpensive. You just got to be careful. They've got some dropout and some of those kind of things, but you can buy used units that work very effectively for what you guys are trying to do.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Good to hear your voice.
Good.
Chris.
Well, from my perspective on the Carcass Ultrasound Committee to the producers out there, I hope we can test, and I have an interest in talking to Tommy about this, but I would want these to be tested before you go buy them, because 5,000 could be the worst 5,000 you ever spent. And not that they're not good, but we haven't tested them and we need to make sure they work. I would rather put my efforts in trying to find a used machine, like Tommy just said, to know that you can get it and that it's proven technology. My biggest fear after seeing a lot of animals scanned with convex probes is the image quality might be all right, but can they find their landmarks and you are trained effectively to use it? And we need to train differently than we're currently training if we're going to start using those probes. That needs to be a different layer of training. So I do ask producers, I saw this happen in ultrasound technology too. A lot of cheap ultrasound preg tone type units came out, and I'd try to follow in after a producer and they said, man, I wish I wouldn't have spent the money. I just would have kept going to the vet and getting preg checked. So I don't want to, I'm cautious on the new units. I think it'll be outstanding and fantastic if we can get them working, and it'll be cheaper, but I'd say let some people test them before we drop the 5,000, unless you have a reason for pregnancy testing, and then it can pay for itself that way.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I have to bow out. I will be back if you're still on in about 10 minutes.
All right. Thanks, Chris. There was one point I'm going to share my screen here because I don't think that we've made it. It's been mentioned, but I don't know that we've really hit it as hard as we should. And it kind of comes from Wes's comment about scanning rams at a ram test or a ram sale. And we need to make sure if we're doing that we're doing some weight adjustments. So I'm showing a slide here, and I just want to point out the blue line, which is the loin eye area as an animal gains weight. And so you can see here at 165 pounds, these rams had a 2.75. At 200 pounds, it was 3.37. Of course, this is an average across the group, but what NSIP is doing is you're submitting a weight with a loin eye measurement, whether that's depth or area, or it's going to be depth. But if they're doing anything where we're not doing breeding values, I strongly urge whomever's organizing the ram sale or some others to do some weight adjustments, because if not, we're just still picking the biggest animal, and a scale is a lot cheaper than an ultrasound.
Reed, this is Wes again. And in our situation, we get like 500 rams to a ram sale that have no information behind them. Consequently, we have to create some for the buyers to use to make their selections. And so we do a range ram index that has a combination of the weights and the ultrasound data that we collect that day. And by doing that, we hope that we're appealing to the person that is selling basically on weight, and those that are going to maybe Cody's program where they're trying to hit the sweet spot of his grid with carcass qualities. And by combining the two, we have finally gotten some followers that are buying based on the index that we provide that way.
Very good. Thanks, Wes. Knowing you, I knew that you had probably thought that through and researched it, and I was a part of it, but I just didn't want our listeners to hear that, you know, scanning rams at a ram sale is what's the best case scenario. It's probably a good step in the right direction, but there's limitations to it as well. So appreciate your comments. Thanks.
I was going to try and bring up the California Wood Growers Index, but I'm struggling to find it now. I know I had it at one point. Okay.
Gene Edmondson, you have another question?
So I'm a little confused because I've heard in the past that you cannot use a pregnancy scanning device for the carcass scanning. Can you use the same device, just different probes?
In some instances, Tommy can answer too. I was going to say in some instances, yes. I mean, that Aloka that we use in Wisconsin here, it's got multiple different probes to it. So I suspect there's some units, talking out of turn here since Tommy jumped back on, but there's some that probably only have a single probe attached.
Yeah, the units anymore, they'll actually go from a 3.5 to 5 to 7.5 megahertz. Those are available now. But what you really want to concern about is buy the unit, and they've got multiple probes that attach to those. So if you've got a repro probe, and then you can buy a cheap carcass probe like the 5011 for an Aloka and add that to the unit you're scanning with.
Great, thank you.
All right. Any last questions? Okay, well, thanks for everyone for participating. I know it was a pretty good stretch of time, but there was a lot of materials to cover. Thank you so much for all of our presenters and panelists for taking the time to be with us and sharing that information for the benefit of the sheep industry moving forward. Again, we will be hosting our ultrasound certification school on the 4th and the 5th. And so if you're interested in that, shoot me an email at reed.redden@ag.tamu.edu, or if you reply maybe to the registration of this event, I'm sure Brent will forward that on to me. And again, we'll have a press release coming out. And if you just have some general interest in using the technology, maybe you want to come by the school and see it firsthand, we probably can accommodate that. We want to thank Capra for being on today as well. They were so willing to help us out with the school and harvest the lambs and help us get data and be a valuable partner in this moving forward. So thanks again, everyone. Have a great afternoon or early evening, depending on where you live.
Reed, you might mention that we recorded this and where you're going to post it.
Oh, good. Thank you, Brent. Yes, well, this will be recorded and we are going to post it on the YouTube channel. It's Sheep and Goats at Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. So once we get that recording, Brent, maybe we'll send an email out to all the all the people who registered for the event, so they'll have that link. Thanks.